April 10, 1944. Outside Casino, Italy. Cold rain drifted sideways across the rubble-strewn hillside, hissing against shattered stone and the twisted hulks of broken pines. The ground shook intermittently, sometimes from distant artillery, sometimes from nothing more than the rumble of collapsing buildings further down the slope. Oberstfreiter Karl Brenner pressed a mud-soaked field dressing against the side of his abdomen, feeling the warm seep of blood pressing through his fingers. His vision blurred, cleared, then blurred again. Around him, the remnants of his platoon crawled, limped, or lay motionless beside the churned earth of the ridge. The American barrage had been short, precise, and devastating. Another shell burst somewhere behind him, showering his helmet with dirt. He didn't flinch. Not anymore. With every breath, the pain in his ribs flared, radiating up into his chest. He tried to rise, once, twice, before his knees buckled beneath him. He fell face first into the mud. For a moment he simply lay there, cheek pressed to the cold ground, the metallic taste of blood creeping into his mouth. His ears rang in a high, steady tone that drowned out the world. Then, boots. Distinct. Heavy. Crunching across wet gravel. Not German jackboots. He knew that sound instantly, the slow, confident walk of men who weren't retreating. American. Karl's breath caught. Propaganda posters flashed in his mind, caricatures of grinning Americans, bayonets dripping, the words "killers without honor" stamped across the top. He tried to roll onto his back, but his strength evaporated. Two shapes emerged through the smoke. Olive drab uniforms. Net-covered helmets. Garand rifles held at the low ready. An American sergeant knelt beside him, the brim of his helmet dripping water onto Karl's field gray tunic. The sergeant's name tape, darkened by rain, read Morris. His face was hard but not cruel, lined with dust and exhaustion. Morris called over his shoulder, "Got another one here. Wounded bad. Somebody get Doc." One of the riflemen kept watch downslope while Morris eased Karl onto his back with surprising care. Karl hissed as pain shot through his ribs. He expected the American's grip to tighten, to become rough, punishing maybe. But Morris merely steadied him, muttering quietly, almost to himself. "Easy, Fritz. You're all right." Fritz. The Americans always used that name. Karl's eyelids fluttered. He tried to speak but managed only a faint rasp. A new figure arrived, a medic easily identified by the red cross painted on his helmet. He dropped to his knees beside Karl with the practiced calm of a man who had seen the worst many times over. The medic glanced at Morris. "Entry wound right side, exits probably lodged. Doesn't look clean. Let's get him tagged." Karl watched the American open his medical pouch. White bandages. A morphine syringe. Metal instruments wrapped in oilcloth. "Everything clean," ordered. The medic cut away Karl's tunic, exposing the wound. Cold air rushed over his skin. The pain sharpened and Karl gritted his teeth, expecting interrogation, derision, something. Instead, the medic leaned closer and said softly, "I'm gonna help you. Understand? Help." Karl blinked. Words failed him. The medic injected morphine into his upper arm. Warmth spread through him almost instantly, dissolving the edges of the pain. His breath steadied. His hearing softened. His world, moments ago nothing but terror and grit, seemed to expand, enough to take in the strangeness of what was happening. American hands were saving his life. Morris and the medic lifted him onto a litter, carefully, cautiously, as if he were one of their own. The rifleman who had been keeping watch now stepped forward to help carry him. Karl recognized the insignia on the soldier's sleeve. 36th Infantry Division. Texans. He had been told they were savages. As they began the slow descent toward the American lines, Karl's head rolled to one side, gaze drifting across the battlefield. Smoke curled over the shattered ridge. His comrades lay scattered across the slope, some moaning softly, some deathly still. He waited for the Americans to sneer, to gloat, to kick aside the dead. They did none of that. Instead, the medic shouted, "Check that one. He's moving, go help him." Another rifleman jogged forward to kneel beside a German corporal Karl recognized from his company. Karl's dulling mind spun. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't what the Reich had promised. The stretcher shifted, and Karl felt rain pattering softly across his face. His vision flickered, black at the edges. He forced his eyes open once more as they passed the American forward post. Timber and sandbags, radio aerials humming, machine gunners tucked behind shields slick with rain. No jeers. No cruelty. Only a medic shouting instructions and a sergeant waving stretcher teams toward the field station below. The impossible truth pressed against Karl's fading awareness. The Americans were treating him as if his life mattered. Soon the field hospital's white tents came into view, bright against the mud and smoke, impossibly clean, marked with enormous red crosses that glowed under the gray afternoon light. He felt himself carried inside. Canvas flaps swept shut behind him. Warm air washed over him along with the smell of disinfectant and boiled water. Carl had crossed a boundary he didn't know existed. And nothing he believed about the enemy would ever fully survive the next few hours. Morphine pulled him deeper into the dark. But the shock lingered. The darkness didn't last. Carl drifted upward through it as voices filtered into his awareness. Calm, clipped, professional. The hum of generators. The distant clatter of surgical trays. The steady rhythm of boots moving with purpose along wooden planks laid across the mud. He opened his eyes. Above him, the canvas ceiling of the American Field Hospital glowed with lantern light, trembling softly each time the wind pushed against the tent walls. The air was warm, warmer than anything outside, and thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic. He wasn't lying on wet earth anymore. He was on a cot. A real cot. His tunic and shirt were gone, replaced with a wool blanket pulled up to his chest. Someone had cleaned the mud from his face. Even the dried blood on his cheek was gone. For a moment he wondered if he had been captured by a propaganda camera crew staging a scene. But then a nurse brushed into view, an American lieutenant with a silver bar on her collar and a stethoscope around her neck. She noticed his eyes. "Good," she said softly. "You're awake." Her accent was unmistakably American, lightly Southern. "I'm Lieutenant Harper. You're in good hands now." Carl tried to lift his head. Pain flared in his side, forcing him back down. Harper placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Don't move. You lost a lot of blood." He stared at her, unable to reconcile the gentleness of her voice with everything he had been taught. His lips trembled as he attempted English. "Why, help me?" Before she could answer, a tall captain stepped beside her, flipping through a clipboard. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and a white apron stained with iodine. "Wound was messy, but the doc's closing you up now," Harper explained. Turning to the captain, she added, "He's lucid." The captain, Dr. Samuel Pierce, according to the name stitched on his apron pocket, gave Carl a brief but reassuring nod. "You'll be heading to post-op soon," he said. "Lucky we got to you before an infection set in." Lucky. Carl couldn't understand. The Americans were calling him lucky? Another voice entered from the left, raspy and annoyed. "For God's sake, Pierce, tell the new kids not to toss the morphine ampoules in the sharps bin. They're clogging the chute again." A medic appeared, arms loaded with bloodied gauze. When he spotted Carl awake, his grumbling stopped. "Well, look at that. Fritz made it through." Carl expected hostility. Instead, the medic gave him a small nod, respectful, almost friendly, before disappearing behind a curtain. Pierce adjusted his glasses. "You're going to feel weak for a while. But you're stable now. We've got 2 of your countrymen in the adjoining ward, both worse off than you." He tapped the clipboard. "We treat everyone who comes through those doors. Understand?" Carl's gaze drifted down the row of cots. There were Americans there, wounded, bandaged, pale. But there were Germans too. Field gray trousers, torn and burned, lay folded at the foot of beds. A Luftwaffe sergeant slept beneath a clean blanket. A Wehrmacht private sipped water from a tin cup while an American nurse checked his pulse. Harper followed his line of sight. "It surprises most of you," she admitted. "But a wounded man is a wounded man. Uniform doesn't matter in here." Carl swallowed hard. This was impossible. This was everything he had been taught to reject. He thought of the propaganda lectures drilled into them since training. Americans were cowards or monsters. Savages who tortured prisoners. Yet here he was, lying in a warm bed, being treated by an American doctor who spoke to him as though he mattered. A new wave of exhaustion washed over him and his eyelids drooped. Harper eased the blanket up. "Get some rest. We'll check on you again soon." As she stepped away, Carl heard the canvas flap open briefly, letting in a gust of cold air. A stretcher team rushed in carrying another wounded man, American. Blood soaked through the man's jacket. Nurses converged instantly. But something else caught Carl's fading attention. Following close behind the stretcher, 2 more litter bearers entered, each carrying a German soldier. One was unconscious, face deathly pale. The other moaned softly through clenched teeth. An American corporal shouted, "Put the German on table 3. Doc, we need you now." There was no hesitation. No prioritizing of their own over the enemy. It all blurred together, medical skill, urgency, shared humanity. Everything his officers had preached collapsed under the weight of what he was seeing. Warm air, soft murmurs, the clink of surgical tools. His last clear thought before sleep reclaimed him was simple, bewildered, and irrevocable. The enemy is saving us. When Carl awoke again, the light inside the tent had changed. Lanterns had been dimmed. A low amber glow filled the ward, broken only by the silhouettes of nurses moving from cot to cot. Outside, rain drummed softly against the canvas, steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. His side throbbed with a deep, dull ache, but the sharp pain was gone. The bandage around his ribs felt tight and clean. A faint cough sounded from the neighboring cot. Carl turned his head slowly. A thin, blond soldier lay beside him. Another German, perhaps 19 at most. His face was waxy, eyes half open, breath shallow. An American medic stood over him, checking the flow of plasma dripping from a suspended bottle. The boy whispered something in German, fearful, hoarse. The medic leaned closer. "No, you're not dying," he said quietly, though the boy clearly hadn't understood the words. "You're safe. Just breathe." Carl watched this for several seconds, stunned by the gentleness. The Reich had promised the opposite, that Americans would finish off the wounded enemy without hesitation. The medic noticed Carl watching. "Oh, you're awake again," he said with an easy smile. "How's the pain? Need another syringe?" Carl shook his head faintly. The medic opted for English simple enough for any POW to understand. "You're gonna be fine. We stitched the bullet path clean. No infection." Carl's eyes drifted to the plasma bottle the boy was receiving. "You give him this?" he mouthed, pointing. The medic frowned in mild confusion. "Of course. He needs it." Carl pressed quietly, "German? Prisoner?" The medic shrugged as if it were obvious. "So, plasma doesn't care what uniform you wore when you got hit." He moved along the cot, but before going he added, "Doc Pierce says you'll be transported to a rear POW hospital once you're stable enough. Until then, rest." A rear hospital. Not an interrogation chamber. Not a punishment camp. A place of treatment. Carl sank back into the cot, mind reeling. Hours passed. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes waking to distant artillery, sometimes to the hiss of sterilizers in the surgical ward. But it was the voices of 2 American soldiers that stirred him next, low, tired conversation somewhere near his feet. They were packing crates, likely preparing for another influx of wounded. "You hear the German kid ask if we were gonna shoot him?" "Yeah. They all think that at first." "Well, after what their officers tell him. Guess I can't blame him. Propaganda works until reality smacks him in the face. Triage tent was full of them today. Doc treated him the same as ours. Hell, sometimes better. You see table 2? That guy was too far gone, but Pierce tried anyway." "Yeah. War's hell, but inside this tent, a man's a man." Their words were not meant for Carl, but he heard every one. Inside this tent, a man's a man. Slowly he turned his head toward the aisle. 2 American enlisted men were stacking empty morphine tins, their weary movements softened by the warm light. They looked nothing like monsters or savages. They looked like farmhands, factory workers. Ordinary men doing the best they could in a world consumed by fire. Carl felt a shiver, not from cold, but from a sudden, overwhelming awareness that he no longer understood the war he had been fighting. A shadow shifted to his right. Lieutenant Harper had returned. She approached with a chart under one arm. "You're healing well," she said, giving him a brief but genuine smile. "We'll keep you here through the night, maybe another day. After that, a truck's taking a group of your men to the evacuation station." Carl studied her for several seconds before speaking. "You treat Germans like Americans?" Harper glanced down the row of cots, thinking. Then she answered simply, "We treat wounded. That's our job." She started to move on, but Carl's voice, quiet, fragile, stopped her. Thank you." It was halting English, but she understood. She nodded, her expression softening. "You're welcome." Before she could step away, another stretcher burst through the tent flap, 2 orderlies carrying an American infantryman with a mangled leg. Harper immediately turned and rushed toward the chaos. But she didn't tell the German patients to look away. She didn't order separation. She didn't act as though one man mattered more than another. She moved straight to work. Within minutes, another stretcher followed, this one carrying a German NCO, blood pooling through a torn tunic. Dr. Pierce hurried toward him with the same urgency he'd shown the American. It was equality in action. Undeniable. Visible. Unavoidable. Carl felt his throat tighten. He wasn't sure why. Exhaustion. Or perhaps the realization that for the first time in years, he was being treated not as a soldier, not as an enemy but as a human being. The wind rattled the canvas. Lanterns flickered. Somewhere nearby, a nurse shouted for more bandages. Carl closed his eyes, not from fear but from something closer to peace. Dawn crept into the tent as a dull gray glow, slipping through seams in the canvas and washing the ward in soft light. The rain had stopped sometime during the night. Now only the drip of water from the eaves could be heard between the occasional groan of a wounded man or the clatter of a medical tray. Carl felt clearer than before. The pain had settled into a tolerable ache, and though his body was weak, his mind was racing. A shadow fell across his cot. An American corporal, broad-shouldered, olive-drab jacket smudged with dirt, spoke to him while adjusting his rifle sling. "You're shipping out today?" the corporal said. "Trucks arriving in 20. Carl blinked. "Where?" "Taking us back to a proper POW hospital," the corporal answered. "Bigger than this place. Real beds. Better food too." That last part landed strangely. Better food? For prisoners? Before Carl could ask another question, the corporal moved on, checking the adjacent cots and speaking to the other German wounded with the same tone of routine professionalism. A few minutes later, two medics approached his bed. "You can stand?" one asked. Carl nodded, though not confidently. With their help, he eased himself upright. His legs trembled and used to bearing his weight since the injury. One medic steadied him, while the other draped a clean blanket over his shoulders. As they guided him toward the exit, Carl glanced back down the ward. He saw the blond boy from the neighboring cot now asleep, breathing normally. A nurse was writing notes at his bedside. Across the aisle, the Luftwaffe sergeant nodded off to the soft hum of a field sterilizer. On the far side, a young American private smiled weakly as a German POW in the next cot whispered something Carl couldn't hear. Perhaps a joke, perhaps a shared complaint about the hospital food. The war outside did not exist here. Inside these walls they were all simply wounded men. The medics led Carl toward the tent flap. Warm morning light poured in. When the canvas parted, the outside world felt almost unreal. The battlefield smell had faded. The air was fresh with the scent of wet earth. Birds, actual birds, trilled weakly from the shattered trees beyond the encampment. A line of wounded Germans stood or sat near the back of a truck. Some were bandaged, some on crutches, some pale but alert. American guards stood nearby, rifles slung, posture relaxed but watchful. There were no shouts, no cruelty, no mocking. Just order. Just routine. As Carl limped toward the waiting truck, he heard another language amid the murmurs: Italian, then Polish, then English again. A group of local civilians, women and elderly men, were being escorted past the camp. They paused when they saw the wounded Germans boarding the truck. One of the civilians, a wrinkled old man with a cane, spat on the ground and muttered something Carl didn't catch. Carl tensed. But the American sentinel stepped forward immediately. "Keep moving," the soldier told the civilians firmly. Not cruelly, not threatening. Just enough to disperse them before the situation escalated. Carl didn't understand. Why defend them? Why protect enemy wounded from the anger of civilians who had suffered under German occupation? He had no answer. The medics guided him up the small ladder at the back of the truck. Wooden benches lined the interior. Two German soldiers nodded in silent acknowledgement as he sat, one with his arm in a sling, the other with a bandage wrapped around his head. Near the front of the truck, another stretcher was secured. A German NCO. Unconscious but alive. Alive because American surgeons had fought for him. The engine coughed to life. Before the canvas flap closed, Carl caught one last glimpse of the Field Hospital, the Red Cross stark against the white canvas, the medic teams bustling in and out, treating Americans and Germans without distinction. A nurse hurried past carrying a tray of clean surgical tools. A doctor barked orders at an orderly to prep for another operation. A wounded American infantryman limped toward the X-ray tent beside a German who leaned on him for support. Then the flap dropped shut and the truck jolted forward. The Germans sat in silence as the road vibrated beneath them. No one spoke. No one needed to. They were all thinking the same thing. This was not how the enemy was supposed to act. Carl stared at his hands, clean now, wrapped carefully with fresh gauze. No American had struck him. None had insulted him. None had refused him treatment. Everything he had been told about Allied brutality had evaporated in less than 24 hours. The truck rumbled on, heading toward the rear, toward a hospital where, he had been assured, the standard of care would be the same. Through the canvas walls, Carl heard the faint echo of distant artillery far ahead. The war went on. But for him, and many others, something irreversible had already begun. The truck rolled north for more than an hour, winding along a rough road gouged with ruts from constant troop movement. Carl felt every jolt in his ribs, but he remained upright, gripping the wooden bench to steady himself. Eventually the convoy slowed. Voices outside. Gravel crunching under boots. The truck eased to a stop. A moment later, the canvas flap was swept aside and a sergeant called up, "All right, fellas. This is your stop. Take it slow coming down." 2 American MPs stood beside the vehicle, helmets white-banded, batons at their hips but rifles slung casually across their backs. Their posture was relaxed, alert but not threatening. Carl hesitated at the top of the truck's small ladder. The MPs stepped forward immediately, hands raised not to strike but to steady. "You're good," one assured him. "Take your time." Carl climbed down, feeling the cool morning air settle over him. Before him stood a cluster of stone buildings, an old Italian monastery converted into a medical facility. Newly strung electrical wires ran between the structures. Red Cross flags hung from windows and doorways. American medical personnel moved briskly along walkways, clipboard in hand, assisting both Allied and Axis wounded entering the wards. The Germans were led toward the central cloister, now lined with neat wooden cots shaded beneath the arches. Even from a distance, Carl saw German uniforms scattered among American ones, blue Luftwaffe trousers, field gray tunics, Afrika Korps caps, and American olive drab all lying side by side. The war had dissolved inside these walls. As the group approached, a lieutenant with a Red Cross armband stepped forward. His clipboard was packed with papers, and his glasses were smudged with fingerprints. "All right, line up. One at a time. I need names, ranks, units, and wounds. Cooperate and this'll go fast." His tone wasn't harsh, just efficient. Carl waited quietly as the men ahead of him answered questions in halting English or with the help of an interpreter. When his turn came, the lieutenant looked him over. "Name? Karl Brenner. Rank? Oberstfreiter. Unit? 45th Infantry. Division. Wehrmacht." The lieutenant nodded, jotting it down. "Wound? Bullet, right side. Field hospital treated yesterday. Pain level?" Carl thought. "Manageable. You'll get checked by a doc. Until then you're in Ward C." Ward C. It sounded almost ordinary, like something a civilian hospital would use. A young American medic led him through an arched hallway. The stone walls were cool to the touch, and sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. As they entered Ward C, Carl was momentarily overwhelmed. Rows of cots lined the old refectory, each with a small wooden stand beside it. Some held American soldiers. One writing a letter, another sleeping, another reading a tattered magazine. But just as many cots held Germans. A few smoked cigarettes handed out by American staff. 2 Wehrmacht privates played cards with a corporal who had one leg in a cast. When the medic pointed to an empty cot, Carl limped toward it slowly. Across from him, a German sergeant with a bandaged head raised a hand. "You just come in?" he asked in German. "Yes," Carl replied quietly. The sergeant nodded toward the Americans bustling through the ward. "You'll get used to it," he said. "Takes a day or two." Carl eased himself onto the cot, wincing at the ache in his side. "Used to what?" he asked. The sergeant smirked. "To the fact that everything they told us back home was garbage." Before Carl could respond, a doctor approached, an older man with graying hair and sleeves rolled to the elbows. His collar bore the insignia of a major. "I'm Dr. Whitman," he said. "Let's have a look at that wound." He didn't ask permission. He simply assumed the responsibility of care, as if Carl were any patient under his charge. Whitman gently lifted the corner of the bandage. "Clean. No swelling. No odor. Good." He rewrapped the dressing with practiced ease. "You'll get proper meals here," Whitman continued. "You'll take short walks once you're steady. No heavy movement." Carl swallowed. "You treat Germans same as Americans?" Whitman looked up, eyebrows raised. "Of course I do," he said. "The Geneva Convention isn't a suggestion." He stood, brushing off his hands. "You rest. The nurse will bring breakfast in a few minutes." As he left, the sergeant across the aisle chuckled. "You see," he said. "I told you. They actually care if we live." Carl leaned back against the wall, stunned. Breakfast arrived soon after. Porridge, bread, a piece of canned peach, and coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter ersatz he had grown used to. A young American private delivering the tray paused at Carl's cot. "You need anything else?" he asked. Carl shook his head. "This is enough." The private grinned. "You sound surprised." Carl hesitated before answering. "I am." For the first time since the truck ride, he saw another German nearby, a captain, older, stern, his uniform ripped and faded. He had been watching Carl quietly. Finally the captain spoke. "Brenner," he said, "you're not imagining any of this." He nodded toward the American staff. "They treat us well. Better than our own doctors treated the wounded in Russia, I can tell you that." Carl thought of the frozen dead on the Eastern Front, the wounded left behind during retreats, the medical stations overwhelmed and out of supplies. Then he remembered Lieutenant Harper's calm voice, Dr. Pierce's steady hands, the medic's care on the battlefield. A quiet realization settled into him, heavy but liberating. The Americans didn't hate them. Not the wounded. Not the helpless. The captain continued in a low voice, "Many here, they'll never think of the Allies the way they used to." Carl didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Because he already knew. His view of the enemy, of the entire war, had changed forever. Days passed. Carl recovered faster than he expected. The dull ache in his ribs remained, but he could walk without help now, slowly and carefully along the monastery's inner courtyard. The stone tiles were warm under the midday sun. Olive trees rustled gently in the breeze. Somewhere above, pigeons cooed from a bell tower that no longer held its bell. He felt more like a convalescing guest than a prisoner. During those first walks, Carl saw things that made his thoughts more tangled than ever. American soldiers leaning against a low garden wall laughed as two German POWs taught them a card game from home. A Luftwaffe mechanic sat on a bench, sharing a cigarette with an American corporal who nodded with genuine interest as the German recounted pre-war days fixing engines. In a far corner, a nurse knelt beside a wounded German officer, adjusting his sling while speaking softly to calm him. There was no mockery. No contempt. Only humans. Carl continued his slow circuit of the courtyard until he spotted the sergeant from his ward sitting beneath an olive tree, bandaged head leaned back against the trunk. The man waved him over. "Brenner," the sergeant said, patting the ground beside him. "You're walking better." Carl eased himself down with care. "I feel stronger," he admitted. "The doctors say the wound is healing well." "They know what they're doing," the sergeant replied. "Half the reason most of us survived is because the Americans got to us instead of our own medics." Carl didn't respond immediately. He had no wish to insult the German medical corps. He had seen many brave doctors and nurses do their best with too little. But even he couldn't deny the truth. Supply lines were stronger, their hospitals better equipped, their staff less exhausted. And there was something more, something deeper. A conviction visible in every American medic, that a dying man deserved help regardless of his uniform. Carl finally asked, "How long have you been here?" 4 days, the sergeant answered. "Long enough to hear the rumors." Carl turned to him. "What rumors?" The sergeant smirked. "That some POWs write home about this place. About how well they were treated." Carl stiffened. "Is that allowed?" "Strictly speaking, it's censored. But letters get through." The sergeant shrugged. "The Americans don't fear the truth." Carl found himself staring across the courtyard at a pair of large wooden crates stacked beside the gate. They were marked U.S. Army Medical Department. He'd seen similar crates being unloaded from jeeps and carried into the wards, packed with bandages, plasma bottles, antiseptics, tools, clean blankets. The Americans spared nothing. Not even for enemy wounded. He asked quietly, "Do you think people in Germany would believe us?" The sergeant's expression softened. "They will. Eventually. When the war ends and they hear enough voices saying the same thing." Carl didn't know what to say. He sat with the thought, letting the spring air wash over him. A few minutes later, an American nurse approached carrying a clipboard. "Gentlemen," she said, "time for afternoon checks. If you're up and around, that's a good sign, but don't push it." Her German was accented but clear. She had taken the time to learn enough to speak to them directly. Carl rose slowly to his feet. The nurse checked his pulse, inspected the bandage beneath his shirt, commented on how clean the incision looked, then offered a small smile before moving on. As she walked away, the sergeant called after her, "Danke, Schwester." She waved without turning around. Carl felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. A heaviness too, but one that came from understanding, not pain. When he returned to his cot later that afternoon, he found a new arrival lying across from him. A young SS soldier, barely 18. Trembling. Confused. Carl approached slowly. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of another German in the room. Where are we?" he whispered. "AUS POW hospital," Carl said softly. The boy flinched. "They will kill us. They told us, everyone told us." Carl shook his head. "They won't." The boy's breathing quickened. "But, they're Americans." Carl sat at the edge of his cot. "They saved my life. They saved many of us." The boy stared at him as if the world had tilted. "They treat us better than we expected," Carl said. "Better than we deserve, maybe." The boy didn't answer. He merely stared at the pausing figure of an American doctor making his rounds, stethoscope hanging loosely from his neck, notes tucked under his arm, eyes focused and calm as he moved from bed to bed. For the first time, Carl saw his own realization reflected in another's eyes, the shock of discovering that the enemy was not a monster. Not long after, an older German captain, his arm in a sling, spoke from a nearby cot. "You'll see for yourself soon," he told the young soldier. "The Americans follow rules. They give medical care without exception. Whatever the Reich told us, it wasn't the truth." Carl watched the boy swallow hard as though the words physically hurt. He understood that feeling. He had lived it. As the doctor approached to examine the new arrival, Carl returned to his own cot, laying down carefully. He stared at the ceiling, stone arches warmed by sunlight, and realized he had crossed a line he could never retreat from. The Americans weren't the enemy he had been taught to fear. And the truth of their mercy would follow him all his life. 2 more days passed inside the monastery hospital, and Carl no longer felt like a stranger moving through its halls. He had found a rhythm: morning checks, slow walks in the courtyard, quiet conversations with other POWs, sometimes even brief exchanges with the American staff who had long since stopped seeing him as anything unusual. But on the morning of the 5th day, everything shifted. The sound of truck engines rumbled through the courtyard. Bootsteps echoed against the stone. An MP shouted orders at a small group gathered near the gate. Carl looked up from his cot as Dr. Whitman entered the ward, wiping his hands on a towel. "All right, listen up," the doctor said, voice carrying across the room. "Everyone cleared for transport will be moved to a long-term POW camp further north. You're stable enough now for proper housing." A murmur spread through the ward. Some men looked relieved, others nervous. Carl felt a strange mixture of both. Whitman walked down the aisle, scanning charts clipped to the foot of each bed. When he reached Carl, he gave a satisfied nod. "You're strong enough to travel," he said. "Your wound is clean. No complications." Carl swallowed. "Where do we go?" "Camp near Florence. Big place. Proper barracks, good food, clean beds." He gave a small smile. "A lot better than this old monastery, even if it's prettier." Carl didn't return the smile, but not out of fear or resentment. He felt something he hadn't felt since the start of the war: uncertainty about leaving safety behind. Whitman noticed. "You'll be all right," he said softly. "Just follow the instructions from the MPs. And remember, your treatment doesn't end today. The staff there will take care of you." Carl nodded slowly. "Thank you, doctor." Whitman placed a hand briefly on Carl's shoulder. "Get your things. Truck leaves in 15. Thanks." Carl had none, except the blanket the Americans had given him, and the painlessly simple truth he now carried with him. As he stood, the sergeant with the bandaged head approached, tightening the strap of his boot. "Looks like we're headed out together," he said. Carl managed a small nod. "Do you think the next place will be like this?" The sergeant shrugged. "If the Americans run it, I don't see why not." They joined the line forming near the entrance. A young nurse with dark hair Carl recognized from the earlier checks moved down the column, handing each man a canteen and a small cloth bag. "Food for the road," she said, offering Carl the bag. "Sandwiches and apple. Not much but enough." Carl accepted it carefully. "Thank you." She smiled before moving on. Behind him, the young SS soldier, the one who had trembled when he first arrived, stood rigid, clutching the straps of his borrowed American-issue satchel. "Brenner," he whispered, "will they really not harm us?" Carl looked him in the eye. "They won't harm us," he said firmly. "They saved us." The boy's shoulders eased. Just a little. The MPs led them out into the courtyard where sunlight warmed the stones. The truck stood ready, engines rumbling. Their wooden sides were stamped with white stars. The rear flaps were tied open, revealing neat rows of benches and stacked supply crates. A few American soldiers lounged nearby, smoking or drinking from tin cups. They watched the POWs assemble, but there was no hostility in their eyes, mostly boredom, mild curiosity, and the weary fatigue of men who had seen too much war. As Carl stepped toward the truck, he heard a voice call, "Hey, Brenner." He turned, startled. Lieutenant Harper jogged toward him, stethoscope bouncing lightly against her collar. "Good," she said once she reached him, slightly breathless. "I caught you before you left." Carl stood there, uncertain of what to say. Harper offered her hand. He stared for a moment, shocked, then slowly, carefully took it. "You did well," she said. "Stronger than you think. You'll heal quickly." Carl felt a lump form in his throat. Not because of the wound, but because an enemy nurse, a woman his country had insisted would hate him, had shown him nothing but humanity. "Thank you," he managed. "For everything." She nodded once, firmly. "Take care of yourself." Then she stepped back, letting the MPs guide the Germans toward the trucks. Carl climbed aboard with the others. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of wounded men filing in. The MPs secured the rear flap, leaving just a sliver of light. The engine growled. The truck lurched forward. Through the narrow gap beneath the canvas, Carl saw the monastery shrink behind them, the courtyard, the arches, the red cross fluttering in the wind. He didn't look away until it disappeared around a bend. The truck bounced along the road, but inside, the Germans sat in silence. Not fearful, not angry, but stunned in a way words couldn't describe. Finally, the sergeant beside him exhaled. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "What?" Carl asked. The sergeant stared ahead, voice quiet. "To be treated like a human, by the enemy." Carl turned that over in his mind for several seconds before answering. "No," he said softly. "Not strange." He looked at the men seated around him, bandaged, bruised, tired. "It's hopeful." No one responded. But no one disagreed. The truck rumbled north, leaving behind a battlefield, and carrying with it dozens of men who would never again believe the lies they had been taught. The convoy rolled north for hours, winding through the battered countryside. Burnt-out farmhouses, cratered roads, and columns of weary Allied troops passed by in a blur. Yet inside the canvas-covered truck, the German POWs remained unusually quiet, each man locked in his own shifting thoughts. By mid-afternoon, the rumble of engines slowed. The truck turned off the main road and onto a gravel path lined with poplar trees. Ahead, rising behind double rows of barbed wire and wooden guard towers, stood an orderly collection of long, low barracks. The sign at the gate read, U.S. Army, POW Camp Florence. The truck halted with a hiss of brakes. MPs walked alongside, tapping the tailgate. "All right, let's go. One at a time." The rear flap lifted, flooding the interior with sunlight. Carl blinked as he climbed down, boots crunching on gravel. A warm breeze carried the faint smell of dust, mown grass, and something surprising, freshly baked bread. He glanced at the other Germans. They smelled it too. A lieutenant in crisp khaki stood waiting at the base of the platform, a clipboard in hand. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the composed bearing of a schoolteacher rather than a prison officer. "Welcome to Florence," he announced in a calm, almost conversational tone. "You'll find this camp follows the Geneva Convention strictly. That means you will work, you will follow rules, and in return, you will be given proper food, shelter, and medical care." He surveyed the men, pausing as his eyes settled on their bandages. "And judging by the state of you fellows, you'll be reporting to the infirmary first." The Germans exchanged puzzled glances. "An infirmary? Here." Carl felt a flicker of disbelief. After all, they were prisoners now, fully processed, delivered, registered. Surely the days of American doctors treating them as equals were behind them. Yet as the group was ushered across the yard, he saw it with his own eyes. Near the center of camp stood a long wooden building marked with another red cross, its door propped open to let in the breeze. Inside, rows of beds were already prepared, sheets crisp and white. Cabinets were stocked with gauze, disinfectant, glass bottles of sulfa powder, morphine, penicillin, and surgical tools arranged with meticulous care. A U.S. Army nurse stepped forward. "Line up. Names and wounds," she said briskly. Carl felt his heart jolt. Not from fear, but from something stranger. Recognition. It was Lieutenant Harper. She blinked in surprise when her gaze landed on Carl, but quickly her expression shifted to a composed, professional nod. "You made it," she said. Carl straightened instinctively. "Yes, Lieutenant." Harper gestured to a cot. "Sit there. I'll check your stitches after I handle the new arrivals." As she turned away, the young SS soldier whispered to Carl, "Is that?" "Yes," Carl answered quietly. "The same nurse from the monastery." The boy's eyes widened. Why would she be here? To watch over us again? Carl didn't know. But a strange warmth spread through his chest at the thought. The processing took an hour. The Americans moved efficiently, checking charts sent from the field hospital, updating medical files, distributing uniforms stamped with PW, and issuing blankets and toiletries. There was no shouting. No threats. No humiliation. If anything, the officer seemed almost bored by the routine. When Harper finally returned to Carl, she lifted the edge of his bandage with practiced ease. No redness. No heat. Good. She tied the wrap neatly, then stepped back. You'll have to avoid heavy work for at least 2 weeks. I'll make a note. Carl lowered his voice. Lieutenant, why did they send you here? I thought field hospitals were always moving. Harper shrugged lightly. Some of the staff rotates between facilities. Besides, she paused, briefly searching his face, someone has to make sure you don't try anything stubborn like tearing out your stitches again. Carl almost smiled. Almost. As she moved to the next patient, the sergeant leaned in from the neighboring cot. Brenner, he murmured, this place, it's not a camp. It's a village. Carl looked around. The room buzzed with quiet, methodical care. Outside, POWs carried crates, swept walkways, or played cards under a shade net. American guards watched from their towers, but casually, rifles resting on shoulders, not trained on the men below. What did we expect? Carl replied softly. Barbed wire and beatings? That's what they told us, the sergeant said. That's what they needed us to believe, Carl corrected. A German medic, also a prisoner, entered the infirmary carrying a box of additional supplies. He nodded politely to the American staff before sorting the materials into designated drawers. The ease of cooperation was surreal. The SS boy whispered, if they treat us this well, how many lies did we swallow? Carl didn't answer at first. He watched Harper as she instructed a corporal on wound cleaning technique, her movements precise, her tone focused, her care unmistakably genuine. Finally he said, all of them. As evening settled over the camp, the prisoners were served their first meal, stew thick with vegetables, rolls warm from the ovens, a slice of pie, and even a cup of coffee. Carl ate slowly, trying to comprehend the simple, quiet dignity of it all. For the first time since the war began, the fear he had learned to carry like a second skin began to loosen. It was here, behind the wire of an enemy prison, that Carl Brenner realized the truth. The Americans had defeated more than his army. They had defeated the lies he was raised on. And the real battle, inside him, had only begun. The first week at Camp Florence passed with an almost unreal calm. Carl rose each morning to the sound of a bugle call, ate breakfast in the mess hall alongside dozens of other POWs, and spent his days in light-duty work assignments, sorting crates, stacking lumber, cleaning walkways. Nothing strenuous. Nothing that strained his healing wound. He slept in a barack with 80 men, each bunk spaced neatly in rows. The room smelled faintly of pine and laundry soap, the wood panels warm in the Arizona sun. By now the faces were familiar, as were the voices. Quiet conversations in Swabian dialect, Bavarian jokes, Saxon curses muttered when boots were misplaced. But one ritual surprised him most. Every Thursday afternoon after the workday ended, a line formed outside the administration hut. Inside, a single desk stood beside a large sack of envelopes, each one pre-printed with a red stamp. Kriegsgefangenenpost, prisoner of war mail letters home. Free as guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. Something no German POW had imagined before capture. Carl hesitated at first. He had nothing to say that would not trouble his parents. Nothing he dared confess, not without risking the censor's scissors or worse, giving them hope that he himself still struggled to find. But on the second Thursday, Lieutenant Harper approached him during the afternoon medical inspection. You're healing faster than expected, she said, securing the bandage with a final tug. If this continues, I'll clear you for regular duty by next week. He nodded. Thank you. She stepped back, studying him a moment longer than she usually did. You haven't written home yet, she said. Carl blinked, surprised she had noticed. How do you know? Harper shrugged. Your chart still has no record of outgoing correspondence. And most men jump at the chance to tell their families they're alive. He hesitated. I don't know what to write. Harper's expression softened. Tell them the truth, she said simply. But Carl wasn't sure he understood what that meant anymore. Later that evening after dinner, he took his place in the line outside the administration hut. A young American clerk sat inside, handing each POW a pencil and a single sheet of thin gray paper. Keep it brief, the clerk said. 1 page only. Germans love to write novels. A few men laughed. Carl sat at one of the wooden tables, staring at the blank paper long enough that the edges curled slightly from the desert air. Finally he began. Dear Mutter, Fata, I write to you from an American prisoner camp in Italy. I know this must come as a shock, but I want you to know first that I am alive and that my wound is healing well. His pencil paused. This next part. This was the part he never imagined writing. You may find this difficult to believe, but the Americans have treated me, and all of us, with kindness. More than that, with dignity. He swallowed as he continued. Their doctors saved my life. Their nurses dress my wounds each day. We receive the same food, the same medical supplies, the same care as their own wounded. He almost scratched that line out. Too unbelievable. Too dangerous. But he left it. I have seen things here that contradict everything we were told. I am safe. I am respected. And I cannot reconcile this with what we were taught about our enemy. His hand trembled. He steadied it. Know that I am no longer afraid. As he finished the letter, he realized that wasn't entirely true. He was afraid, just not of the Americans. He was afraid of what the truth meant for everything he had once believed. He folded the paper, sealed the envelope, and handed it to the clerk. The man tossed it gently into a canvas mailbag. Your family will get it, the clerk said. Might take a month or two, but it'll reach Germany. Carl nodded. Thank you. As he walked back toward the barracks, the sky glowed purple with the last light of dusk. Crickets chirped in the dry grass outside the wire. The warmth of the day lingered on the wood and earth. The sergeant, his head still wrapped in a neat bandage, waited on the steps. You finally wrote, he said. Carl sat beside him. Yes. What did you tell them? Carl took a long breath. The truth. The sergeant stared out over the yard. I wonder, he murmured, how many lies our people back home still believe? How many we believed right up until the moment we were captured? Carl didn't answer. But he felt the truth shifting inside him like a tectonic plate. The old world, built on fear, on propaganda, on hatred, was cracking. And the new world was forming right here behind barbed wire. A world where the enemy saved your life. Where the enemy fed you. Where the enemy shook your hand, cleaned your wounds, and told you to write to your mother. A world that made no sense at all, and yet made more sense than any he had known. 3 more weeks passed, and with them came a rhythm Carl could almost mistake for normal life. Morning roll call. Work assignments. Infirmary checks every other day. Evenings spent sitting outside the barracks as the desert air cooled, trading stories with the same men he had fought beside only months before. But it was one particular evening, one that began like any other, that would change Carl's understanding of the war more deeply than anything the Americans had done so far. The sun had just begun to dip behind the distant hills. The sky shimmered orange and violet. The camp bell rang for the final time that day, signaling the end of work. POWs settled onto the benches outside the barracks, lighting cigarettes, cleaning boots, mending shirts. Carl sat with the sergeant, enjoying the rare tranquility. That was when they saw him, a tall, gaunt prisoner with bright blue eyes and close-cropped blonde hair. His uniform, though stripped of insignia, still bore the ghostly outline where a patch had been removed. An SS officer. He had arrived the previous night with a batch of new prisoners transferred from the front. The others avoided him. Not out of respect, but out of fear. He walked straight toward Carl and the sergeant, stopping a few feet away. You, he said quietly, addressing Carl. You were at the monastery hospital. Carl tensed. Yes. The sergeant shot Carl a warning look, but the SS man continued. I saw you when they loaded us onto the trucks. You told another soldier they would not harm us. Yes, Carl said carefully, studying the man's expression. Because it was true. The SS officer's jaw tightened. Do you believe that? Or were you comforting a boy who needed a lie to survive? Carl felt irritation prick the back of his neck. I believe it because I lived it. The officer stared at him, something cold flickering behind his eyes. I was taught, he said slowly, that surrender to the enemy meant humiliation, torture, execution, that the Allies were animals. Carl kept his voice level. And have you seen any of that here? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the camp, the open yard, the line of POWs receiving fresh water from an American corporal, the guards chatting casually near the gate, rifles slung but not raised. No, he admitted. Then he looked directly at Carl, voice dropping to a near whisper. That is what troubles me. Carl exchanged a bewildered glance with the sergeant. Troubles you? What? The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. Because if they are not the monsters we were told, his eyes tightened. Then what does that make us? The question hung between them like a weight. Carl felt the desert breeze brush across his skin, carrying dust, the smell of cooking stew from the mess hall, and the faint creak of the barracks' wooden walls. For the first time he saw something crack in the SS officer's expression. Not fear, not anger, but confusion. He was a man whose identity had been built on the certainty of an enemy who was less than human. And now that certainty was slipping. Carl stood slowly. What they told us, all of it, it wasn't meant to help us win, he said. It was meant to make us obey. The officer stared back, unblinking. Carl continued, voice steady. We were told the Allies were brutal, so we'd fight harder. Fight longer. Fight when there was no hope left. But look around. They treat us better wounded than our own officers treated us healthy. The officer clenched his fists. Do not speak of betrayal, he said sharply. Not here. Not in front of them. Carl didn't look away. I'm not speaking of betrayal. I'm speaking of truth. The officer's breath hitched, barely visible but enough. In that moment Carl understood something. Even the most devoted, the most indoctrinated, the most hardened among them could not ignore what they saw with their own eyes. The truth was too plain. Too undeniable. An American guard passed nearby, nodding politely. Evenin', fellas. The officer flinched at the casual kindness. Carl said quietly, they don't hate us. The officer whispered back, they should. Maybe, Carl said. But they don't. The sergeant leaned forward, breaking the tension. Sit with us, he said. No ranks here. No insignia. Just men trying to understand what comes next. To Carl's surprise, the SS officer hesitated, truly hesitated, before lowering himself onto the bench beside them. For several minutes, the three men sat in silence as the sky faded into darkness and the camp lights flickered on. Finally the officer spoke, voice barely audible. If everything we were taught is a lie, then what do we become when the war ends? Carl didn't answer right away. He looked around the camp, the lights, the guards, the prisoners, the quiet hum of an evening settling over men who were once enemies. Then he said softly, we become men who have to choose for ourselves. The officer swallowed hard. As the night deepened, Carl realized something profound. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the medical care. It wasn't even the humane treatment that shook German soldiers the most. It was that their enemy, the enemy they had been taught to hate, was giving them something their own leaders never had. A chance to think. A chance to question. A chance to change. And for many, that was the most terrifying truth of all. 2 days after the unsettling conversation with the SS officer, Camp Florence woke to an unusual sight. A convoy rolled through the main gate just after sunrise, not American trucks this time, but 3 olive-green vehicles marked with the unmistakable red emblem. International Committee of the Red Cross. Every POW who saw them stiffened. Not from fear, but from the jolt of something close to hope. The sergeant nudged Carl. Looks like we're getting visitors. Carl nodded, but he felt something deeper stirring. If the Red Cross was here, it meant one thing. The truth, whatever it was, would no longer come secondhand from American guards or passing rumors. It would come from a neutral voice. A voice the Germans had no reason to distrust. Within minutes, the camp buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Prisoners stood at attention near the fences. American MPs cleared paths through the yard. And from the central barracks, Colonel Matheson, Camp Florence's commanding officer, emerged in a pressed uniform and polished boots. Behind him walked 2 men in gray suits, carrying leather cases and clipboards. They approached with an air of calm authority, nodding to the POWs as they passed. The Red Cross delegates. One was a Frenchman, tall and thin with silver-rimmed glasses. The other, shorter, broader, wore a Swiss pin on his lapel. Matheson saluted them formally. Gentlemen, welcome to Florence. The Swiss delegate returned the gesture. Colonel, thank you for receiving us. We're here to inspect conditions, verify medical facilities, and speak privately with prisoners. Carl exchanged looks with the sergeant. Privately? Yes. This was what the Germans had been waiting for. Within the hour, small groups of POWs were brought into the administration hut for individual interviews. The Red Cross delegates asked about everything: food, shelter, treatment, medical care, work assignments, discipline, mail delivery, even the attitude of the guards. No officers present. No listening devices. No pressure. Just questions, and the freedom to answer them truthfully. Carl was among the last to be called. The Swiss delegate greeted him with a warm but formal smile. Sergeant Karl Brenner, yes? Please sit. Carl lowered himself into the wooden chair. The room smelled faintly of ink and dust. The delegate opened his notebook. We have reviewed your medical file. You were treated first in a field hospital, then transferred here. How would you describe your care? Carl hesitated, not because he doubted what to say but because the truth felt almost surreal. The care was, he paused, better than I expected. Better than I've ever received, honestly. The French delegate raised an eyebrow. Better than in the Wehrmacht? Carl exhaled. Much better. They scribbled a note. And your treatment here? The Swiss delegate asked. Has it been consistent? Respectful? Carl nodded. Yes. The nurses and the doctors, especially Lieutenant Harper, have been fair, professional, humane. The French delegate tapped his pen. Have you witnessed mistreatment of any German prisoner? Carl didn't even have to think. No. The delegates exchanged a faint, knowing glance. Then came the question Carl didn't expect. Have you been informed, the Swiss delegate asked, of the treatment German POWs receive in other American camps? In the United States, for example? Carl blinked. In the United States? No, he said cautiously. We've heard nothing. The French delegate leaned forward. You should know then. It may help your understanding of the situation. He opened a folder and placed a photograph on the table. Carl stared. It showed German POWs, clean, well-fed, sitting at long wooden tables in what looked like a camp cafeteria. They were smiling. One man played an accordion. Another held a book. Carl felt his breath catch. These men are in a camp in Nebraska, the delegate said. Others are in Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia, dozens across the American mainland. Carl looked up slowly. They look free. Under supervision, of course, the Swiss delegate said. But allowed recreation, music, sports, even education. Some volunteer for farm labor and earn wages. Carl's jaw tightened. Wages? Music? Books? The French delegate continued gently. The Americans, by treaty, must match the treatment your country gives to Allied POWs. As you know, he hesitated just for a moment. Conditions in German camps have not always been equal. Carl swallowed hard. You mean, the camps in the East? The delegates exchanged another quiet look. Neither spoke for a long moment. Finally the Swiss representative said softly, We inspect many camps. Some treat prisoners according to the law. Some do not. And some, he paused, we are not permitted to inspect at all. Carl understood instantly. Everyone did. A coldness settled beneath his ribs. The Red Cross delegate continued, voice gentle, deliberate. The Americans, whatever their flaws, generally follow the convention. That is why you are alive, Sergeant Brenner. Why so many of your comrades are alive. Carl stared at the photograph again. Smiling Germans. Healthy Germans. Germans learning English, playing soccer, writing letters home. Men who looked almost as though the war had passed them by entirely. For the first time, Carl felt something that bordered on shame, not for his capture but for how deeply he had misjudged those who now held him. What happens to us after the war? Carl asked quietly. The Swiss delegate closed his notebook. You will return home, he said simply. Alive. That is what matters. When Carl stepped back into the sunlight, he felt hollow, not from despair, but from the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. Around him, other POWs whispered in clusters, comparing what the Red Cross had told them. Some sounded relieved. Others confused. A few angry. The SS officer from earlier stood alone near the fence, arms crossed. He didn't look at Carl. He didn't need to. The truth had reached him too. As night fell over Camp Florence, Carl realized the full scope of what had happened. The propaganda had shattered. Not slowly. Not gradually. But all at once, with the quiet voice of a Swiss diplomat, and a single photograph of German prisoners smiling in America. The evening after the Red Cross inspection carried a strange tension, quiet, heavy, and electric. Camp Florence usually wound down peacefully after sunset, prisoners gathering in small groups under the fading orange sky. But tonight the atmosphere felt suspended. Men spoke in low voices. Arguments flickered then died. Some sat alone, staring at nothing, wrestling privately with the revelations of the day. Carl felt it too. A pressure behind the ribs. A discomfort that had nothing to do with wounds or weather. He had believed many lies. He had trusted many untruths. But the Red Cross had forced something into the open that no POW could ignore. If the Americans treated their prisoners humanely, and Germany did not, then what did that say about the cause they had fought for? And what did it say about the future? The wind picked up suddenly, kicking dust across the yard. The Arizona desert was unpredictable that way, calm one minute, violent the next. The sergeant squinted toward the horizon. Storm coming. Carl nodded. A big one. The guards moved to secure equipment. Barracks doors were latched tight. The sky darkened rapidly, clouds rolling in like a massive gray wall. Then came the first crack of thunder. A ripple of unease passed through the camp. Sandstorms were common enough, but this one hammered the camp with a ferocity that felt almost symbolic. Wind howled across the yard, tearing through canvas, slamming shutters and sending grit stinging across exposed skin. Lights flickered. Tumbleweeds bounced violently against the fences. Inside, an MP called, motioning for stragglers to get into the barracks. The wind swallowed his voice, ripping it into shreds. Carl and the sergeant shoved their way toward the nearest door. The SS officer, who had avoided Carl all day, was struggling against the gale, shielding his face from the flying sand. A sudden gust knocked him sideways. His boot caught on a loose board. He pitched forward violently, straight toward the outer fence. Carl didn't think. He moved. He grabbed the officer's arm, pulling him upright before the man crashed into the barbed wire. The officer wheeled around, shocked. Carl shouted over the gale, "Get inside." The officer stared at him, truly stared, through the stinging dust. "Why?" he shouted back. "Why did you help me?" Carl tightened his grip, pulling him toward the barracks door. "Because we're not enemies anymore." He wasn't sure where the words came from, or why they felt so strangely, painfully true. The storm roared louder, drowning out the officer's reply. Together, the three men shoved into the barracks, slamming the door behind them. Inside, dim yellow lamps cast trembling shadows across the crowded room. POWs huddled near their bunks, coughing sand from their throats. The storm battered the walls like an angry fist. Dust seeped through cracks. A beam creaked ominously overhead. The SS officer sat heavily on a bench, breathing hard. Carl sat beside him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the officer said quietly, "You could have let me fall." Carl shook his head. "No. You should have," the officer muttered. "It would have been easier." Carl turned to him, voice steady. "For who?" The officer looked away. His composure, once rigid and unbreakable, was crumbling in the dim, dusty light. "I don't understand any of this," he whispered. "Every rule I lived by, every oath I swore, everything I believed, it's been overturned." Carl nodded slowly. "I know." The officer's voice cracked. "What am I if not a soldier of the Reich?" Carl answered the only way he could. "You're a man. Just a man. Like the rest of us." A long silence followed. The wind screamed outside, rattling the walls so violently that some of the younger POWs flinched with each new gust. The sergeant sat on the other side of the officer. "We're all starting over," he said. "Whether we want to or not." The officer closed his eyes. "I don't know how," he whispered. Carl placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not as an act of sympathy, but solidarity. None of us do." Outside, the storm reached its peak, a swirling, violent force that shook the barracks like a ship at sea. Inside, something else was shifting, quietly, painfully, irreversibly. For the first time since capture, the dividing lines between the POWs began to dissolve. Not because the Americans demanded it, not because the war forced it, but because, for a brief fragile moment inside a shaking wooden barrack in the middle of the desert, they all understood the same truth. They were not fighting for a country anymore. Not for a cause. Not for a flag. They were fighting, for the first time, for their own humanity. When the storm finally began to die, the camp settled into a long, exhausted silence. The barracks still shuddered occasionally as the wind tapered off. But something fundamental had changed. Inside Carl. Inside the sergeant. Inside the SS officer. Inside all of them. The propaganda they had believed for years had finally collapsed. Not from American bullets, not from Allied victories, but from the simple, undeniable evidence of how the enemy treated them. And now they would have to decide what kind of men they would be when the war ended. The morning after the storm dawned strangely calm. A soft, golden haze hung over Camp Florence, the desert scrub still dusted with the remnants of the night's fury. The fences glimmered with dew. The air smelled of wet sand, a rare fragrance in Arizona. Carl stepped outside his barracks and felt the quiet settle over him like a blanket. No shouting. No arguments. No SS officers lecturing about loyalty. Just the steady rhythm of a camp waking up. Footsteps, low conversation, the distant clatter of pots from the mess hall. And something else. A feeling that the ground beneath their feet had shifted. The storm had stripped away more than loose boards and stray shingles. It had torn open a space in the hearts of the prisoners, a space that could finally hold doubt, grief, and possibility. By midday, a message was posted on the bulletin board: mail call at 1,500 hours. Letters must be reviewed by the censors. Outgoing mail permitted. Mail days were always tense. Outgoing letters were screened by American staff, incoming ones by German authorities before they ever left Europe. Most arrived redacted, entire sentences blacked out in thick ink. But today that tension carried a new weight. Carl retrieved a pencil stub from his locker. The sergeant pulled out a folded piece of paper he'd been saving. And the SS officer, who normally wrote nothing, sat at a table, staring at a blank page as if it were an enemy he'd never trained to fight. At 1,500, guards passed out envelopes. Carl unfolded a letter from his sister, scribbled in hurried handwriting. We heard rumors of terrible treatment by the Americans. Stay strong. Do not believe what they tell you. We know they are cruel. Carl exhaled, slowly. The sentence didn't make him angry. It didn't even surprise him. But reading it now, after everything he had seen, after everything the Americans had given him, it felt like holding a ghost in his hands. A ghost of a world that no longer existed. He lowered the letter and looked at the others. All around the yard, German POWs were frozen in similar states of disbelief. Men whose lives had been shaped by propaganda since childhood were staring at words that no longer matched their reality. Some frowned. Some scoffed. Some wept openly. The sergeant approached, holding his own letter. My wife wrote that she heard American camps starve prisoners. He gave a hollow laugh. I've gained 6 pounds. Carl folded his sister's letter carefully. We can't blame them. They only know what they're told. A soft voice spoke behind him. Then we must tell them ourselves. Carl turned. The SS officer stood there, still stiff, still reserved, but something was different. His eyes were clearer, his posture less rigid. He held a pencil. And a blank sheet. Carl nodded. You're going to write home. Yes. The officer swallowed hard. For the first time, honestly. He sat down at the outdoor table and began writing slowly, deliberately, as if each word weighed more than the last. Carl watched him for a moment, then returned to his own seat. At first, the words came with difficulty. Dear Anna, I hope this letter reaches you. I hope you and the children are safe. His pencil hovered. What came next felt like stepping off a cliff. You must know something. What we were told about the Americans. It is not true. His heart hammered. He forced himself to continue. They treat the wounded first without asking which side they fought for. They feed us. They do not strike us. They do not mock us. They treat us as men. Around him, other POWs were writing similar truths. Across the yard, a young private murmured as he wrote, My mother won't believe a word of this. Another soldier shrugged. Write it anyway. For the first time since arriving at Camp Florence, Carl felt something stir inside him. Not fear. Not resentment. Not uncertainty. But agency. The freedom to tell the truth, even when the truth contradicted everything he'd once believed. After an hour, the SS officer set down his pencil. I have finished. Carl hesitated before asking, What did you write? The officer let out a long breath. I told my father that the Americans saved my life after the air raid. He paused. I also told him that if our nation is to survive what comes after the war, we must learn from our enemies. Carl nodded solemnly. That took courage. No. The officer shook his head slowly. It takes courage to keep believing in lies. It only takes honesty to stop. The prisoners handed their letters to the guards, who collected them in cloth sacks for processing. No one protested. No one tried to hide anything. For the first time since the war began, the POWs wanted their words to be seen, to be read, to be known. As the sun dipped behind the desert hills, casting long shadows across the yard, Carl stood with the sergeant and the SS officer, watching the mail sacks being carried away. Do you think they'll make it home? The sergeant asked. Carl's answer surprised even himself. I don't know. But the truth is leaving this camp today. He looked at the fading horizon. And that's a start. The officer closed his eyes briefly as if offering a silent prayer. For his family, for Germany, for the world they would return to. For himself. Behind them, the camp buzzed with quiet conversation. Not about propaganda or loyalty or fear of the future, but about what they had seen, what they had learned, and what kind of men they might still become. The war was still raging far away. Europe was still burning. But here, in a quiet corner of the Arizona desert, something remarkable had happened. The prisoners were beginning to reclaim their humanity, one letter, one truth, one choice at a time. 2 weeks after the letters were sent, an unexpected order rippled across Camp Florence. Medical transport arriving at 0900. Detail assigned, assist wounded POW transfers. Carl looked up from the notice board. A hospital train? The sergeant whistled low. Haven't heard of one coming through here in months. The SS officer, who now spent most mornings quietly helping the medics, studied the posting. It says they're German wounded. Recently captured. Carl nodded slowly. The war was reaching its peak in Europe. More prisoners. More casualties. 0900 arrived with the distant wail of a locomotive. The train crawled into the siding beside the camp, its metal sides scorched from travel through the scorching desert sun. Red crosses were painted on every car, faded but unmistakable. American MPs formed a cordon as the medical teams disembarked. Nurses in crisp uniforms, orderlies pushing metal carts, surgeons carrying cases of equipment. Captain Lewis, whom Carl recognized from the camp hospital, strode forward, snapping orders with brisk efficiency. Move the stretcher teams. Keep the walkway clear. Watch the dehydration cases, they're critical. Then came the wounded. The first stretcher down the ramp held a young German corporal, barely 20, his face pale and drawn. His uniform was cut open from the chest down, bandages layered thickly beneath it. His right leg was splinted. And 4 bottle hung above him, swaying gently. Behind him came more, dozens, some conscious, some murmuring deliriously in German, some completely still except for shallow breaths. Carl felt his throat tighten. These were his men. His army. His countrymen. But they were being carried, not by SS paramedics, not by Wehrmacht medics trained in harsh triage, but by American nurses with steady hands and soft voices. One nurse brushed sand from a soldier's forehead. Another adjusted a blanket to keep a man warm. An orderly whispered, "Easy, buddy. We've got you." The SS officer froze beside Carl. It was one thing to be treated well after capture, to be fed, sheltered, respected. It was another to watch your wounded, fresh from battle, receive the same mercy. The officer's jaw clenched. His breath hitched. His eyes flickered with something dangerously close to grief. Carl stepped forward. "Let's help." He moved to a stretcher where 2 Americans were struggling to guide a tall, bandaged officer down the ramp. "Careful," one medic grunted. He took shrapnel through the back. Carl and the SS officer grabbed the frame, easing the weight. The German officer's eyes cracked open. He saw the American uniforms. Then Carl's German tunic. Then the SS runes on the other man's collar. He blinked, confused. Am I in America?" Carl nodded. "Yes, you're safe." The wounded officer frowned as if trying to remember something important. "I thought, the Americans." His voice trailed off. The SS officer finished for him quietly. "We were told they would shoot us." The American medic snorted good-naturedly. "We're medics. We patch people. We don't shoot 'em." Carl felt the weight of those words settle over the wounded officer like a blanket. The stretcher team moved on. More arrived, broken, burned, barely alive. Some cried out for their mothers. Some whispered prayers. Some reached blindly for a hand, any hand. And the Americans offered theirs. Carl felt something warm and painful blossom in his chest, an ache he hadn't expected. This was the truth no propaganda could deny. The Germans weren't being treated according to rules or quotas. They were being treated according to need. According to humanity. Captain Lewis approached Carl and the SS officer. "We'll need translators," he said. "Some of these boys are terrified. Can you talk to them?" Carl nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." To his surprise, the SS officer stepped forward as well. "I can." The captain handed them each a clipboard. "Good. Get their names, conditions, and anything urgent they want to communicate. Families, medical history, whatever helps." Carl followed the medics into the hospital tent where rows of cots had been set up. A young private reached for him with trembling fingers. Wasser water, please," Carl poured a cup and held it to the man's lips. The private drank greedily, then whispered, Are they really Americans?" Carl nodded. "Yes." "And they're helping us?" "Yes." The private swallowed hard. Tears collected in his eyelashes. "I was told they shot prisoners." His voice cracked. "My whole unit believed it." Carl placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "So did we." Across the tent, the SS officer knelt beside a wounded sergeant, helping a nurse adjust the man's bandages. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. The nurse smiled at him. "You're doing fine." The SS officer swallowed. I never imagined I would see this. "War does funny things," she said softly. "But kindness isn't one of them." Outside, the warm desert light filtered through the tent canvas. The air was filled with murmurs, German and English blending into a strange, fragile harmony. By the time the last stretcher was unloaded, Carl felt drained, but something inside him had settled. A truth he could no longer avoid. Compassion had crossed a line the war could not erase. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The Americans didn't just treat the German wounded. They dignified them. They restored them. And that changed everything. The hospital tent at Camp Florence, normally quiet, sparse and half-empty, had transformed overnight into a crowded sanctuary of pain, fear, and healing. The desert sun glowed through the canvas walls, casting soft amber light over rows of cots. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet cloth, and desert dust. Nurses glided between patients. American medics whispered instructions. For bottles clinked gently from makeshift stands. Carl stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, watching as the newly arrived wounded were settled one by one. The place felt different today. War felt far away. Violence felt distant. For the first time since the storm, peace felt possible. A groan from the nearest cot drew his attention. A lieutenant, maybe mid-30s, with salt-streaked hair and a bullet graze across his ribs, was struggling to sit up. Carl rushed to him. "Easy. You'll tear your stitches." The lieutenant blinked, disoriented. Where am I?" "Camp Florence, Arizona. You're in a field hospital now." The man stared, trying to align the thought with the reality. "This is Allied territory?" "Yes." Another blink. Another struggle to comprehend. "And I'm being treated here?" Carl nodded. The lieutenant slowly lay back, staring at the roof of the tent. "I thought Americans would..." His voice faltered. Carl had heard this sentence so many times now he could finish it in his sleep. "You thought they would shoot you," Carl said quietly. The lieutenant's eyes flickered to him, shocked. Carl gave a small, sad smile. "I thought the same when I was captured." A nurse approached, checking the man's bandages. She smiled warmly. "You're going to be okay, Lieutenant. You came in with some rough injuries, but you're stable now." The man stared at her as though she were a hallucination. "You're helping me?" The nurse chuckled. "That's my job." Carl glanced at her. It struck him how effortlessly she said it. "That's my job. Not, that's my duty. Not, that's what I'm ordered to do. Not, I have to treat everyone equally. Just, my job is to heal. So I heal." Even the SS officer, standing across the ward, bandaging a corporal's arm under a medic's supervision, seemed unable to look away from the American's gentleness. For a long while, Carl simply observed. He watched as a nurse tucked a blanket around a soldier whose body was shaking from fever. He watched as Captain Lewis bent down to speak quietly to a delirious private, comforting him like he would his own son. He watched as an orderly fetched an extra pillow for a man who'd lost his right arm. Nothing about it was performative. Nothing about it was political. Nothing about it looked like propaganda. It looked like people helping people. A miracle of its own. A voice spoke quietly behind him. "You know, there is something they do here I do not understand." It was the SS officer. Carl turned. "What?" The officer hesitated. His posture was less rigid now, his expression strangely open, almost vulnerable. "It isn't the food," he said. "It isn't the beds or the rations or the cigarettes." He gestured to the patients, the dozens of wounded Germans being tended with care. "It is this." Carl followed his gaze. The ward was alive with murmurs, soft instructions, and the quiet rhythms of healing. "They treat us as if," the officer searched for the words, "as if we are worth saving." Carl felt something tighten in his chest. The officer lowered his voice. "It is the one thing the Reich never taught us. Worth. The worth of a man outside his uniform." A silence hung between them. Patients coughed softly in their cots. Nurses whispered. Outside, the desert wind rustled the canvas. Carl spoke gently. "I think that's the point." The officer frowned. "What do you mean?" Carl leaned against a wooden support beam, watching an American nurse lift a wounded soldier's hand and check his pulse. "In Germany," he said slowly, "we were taught the state decides who matters. The party decides who deserves life. The uniform decides who is human." The officer nodded. "But here," Carl continued, gesturing to the tent around them. They treat every wounded man, German, American, it doesn't matter, as if his life is precious. The officer swallowed. That is dangerous. Why? Because once a man realizes he has value, the officer looked at his hands that had once sworn loyalty to an ideology built on division and superiority. He stops giving it away. Carl placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. Exactly. A sudden commotion drew their attention. At the far cot, a young German soldier with a head bandage began thrashing, caught in a fever dream. Nein, Zurich. I can't see, please, I can't see. Carl and the SS officer ran to him. The boy, no older than 17, was reaching blindly, terrified. A nurse grabbed his wrist gently. Easy now, you're safe. She guided his hand toward her own cheek so he could feel her presence. It's okay. You're not alone. The boy froze. His fingers brushed her face, smooth skin, warm, decidedly not the face of an enemy. His breathing steadied. Carl watched the moment like it was something sacred. Because it was. A simple human gesture, a nurse guiding a frightened soldier's hand, did something unimaginable. It rewrote everything the boy had been told about his enemy. When the young soldier finally relaxed, the nurse smiled at Carl and the SS officer. He'll need reassurance for a while. Just talk to him. Sit with him. The SS officer sat beside the boy without hesitation. Du bist sicher, he whispered. You're safe. Carl stepped back, watching the scene unfold. The tent, the light, the sounds, they all seemed to blend into something larger than just a hospital ward. It felt like a crack of light in the darkness of war. A place where the world hadn't ended yet. A place where goodness refused to die. Carl finally understood. This was why the German POWs never forgot how the Americans treated them. Not because of comforts, not because of leniency, but because compassion had a way of forcing a man to look at his own beliefs and see them for what they truly were. The truth was simple and terrifying and liberating all at once. Kindness survives war better than hatred. And once a man sees that for himself, there is no going back. For the next several hours, the hospital tent breathed like a living organism, rising with groans, falling with quiet reassurances, steadying with the rhythmic steps of medics moving from cot to cot. Carl worked beside the American staff until his muscles ached. He translated fevers, nightmares, last wishes, and simple requests like water, or my boots, or tell my mother I am alive. But as the ward stabilized and the chaos of the arrival shifted into an exhausted calm, something began to happen. The German wounded, no longer terrified, no longer expecting cruelty, started asking questions. Tentative questions. Questions whispered like confessions. Are you sure the Americans won't punish us for fighting? Do they really treat their own men the same way? Will they let us write letters? Carl answered what he could. The American nurses answered the rest. And slowly, inevitably, the questions grew deeper. More personal. More dangerous. More revealing. Near sunset, a medic named Corporal Jennings approached Carl. Hey, Jennings said, jerking a thumb toward the far cot. That guy's been asking for you. Says he doesn't want to talk to anyone else. Carl followed him. On the cot lay a gaunt soldier with a bandaged chest and eyes still sharp with stubborn pride. He wore the single pip of a Gefreiter on his torn sleeve. Carl recognized the look immediately, a man not ready to surrender anything, not even his fear. Carl pulled a chair beside him. You asked for me? The soldier nodded slowly. My English, not so good. That's all right. The soldier looked around the tent as though checking whether anyone was listening. They give us food. Pause. They treat wounds. A longer pause. They speak softly. Carl nodded. Yes. The soldier's throat bobbed with a hard swallow. Then he whispered the question that had been lurking behind every hushed voice in the tent. Why? Carl blinked. The soldier stared at him with raw intensity. Why do they help us? We are the enemy. We fought them. We killed them. Carl opened his mouth, but stopped. He didn't have an answer. Not one he could speak with certainty. Not one that reached into the heart of what was happening here. He looked around the ward, a nurse adjusting a morphine drip for a man who had likely shot at her countrymen days before. A medic gently lifting a wounded corporal to replace his bandages. Captain Lewis leaning close to a soldier from Bremen, explaining in slow, careful English that his leg would heal with time. What? Carl didn't know. So he gave the only honest answer he could. I will ask. He stood and approached Captain Lewis, who was checking a chart at the supply table. The American doctor looked up with tired eyes but offered a warm nod. Everything all right, Carl? Carl hesitated. One of the men has a question. Lewis waited. Carl took a breath. He wants to know why you help us. Lewis blinked, and for the first time that day he felt completely still. The tent quieted around them. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. Why we help you, Lewis repeated as if tasting the words. Yes, Carl said softly. Why treat us like this? Why give us the same care you would your own men? Lewis looked at the rows of wounded Germans, men who had tried to kill Americans only days before, men who marched under Hitler's flag, men whose uniforms still carried the dust of battle against his country. He set down the chart. Then he spoke, not as a soldier, not as an officer, but as a human being. Because the war is between nations, he said quietly. Not between you and me. Carl felt the words hit like a hammer, soft but unstoppable. Lewis continued, you fought because you were told you had to. I fight because my country asked me to. But when a man is bleeding, when he's scared, when he's dying, he isn't German or American anymore. He gestured to the rows of beds. He's just a man who needs help. And if I forget that, then I have no right to wear this uniform. Carl stood speechless. Lewis exhaled slowly, then gave a small, sad smile. My father always said, if you want to win a war, you must stay human while fighting it. The moment you stop being human, you've already lost. Carl swallowed hard. Behind him, the wounded soldier watched them both with wide, glassy eyes, listening, absorbing, believing. Lewis placed a hand on Carl's shoulder. Tell him we help because it's the right thing to do. Not because he earned it. Because we owe it to ourselves to do what's right. Carl returned to the soldier's cot. The man was trembling, not from fever but from something far more overwhelming. What did he say? Carl knelt beside him. He said the war is between governments, Carl whispered. Not between men. He treats you because you're a person, not an enemy. The soldier's breath shuddered. He turned his face toward the canvas roof, eyes shining. No one ever told me that before. Carl's voice cracked. Nor me. Around them, the ward hummed with life again. Soft movements, quiet care, small miracles happening in plain sight. And for the first time, Carl realized what had been happening all along. The Americans weren't just healing bodies. They were healing something deeper. Something Germany had wounded long before the first shot of the war was ever fired. The belief that a man's value came from his humanity, not from the flag he carried. Night settled over Camp Florence like a slow descent of velvet. The hospital tent dimmed as lanterns were lowered and nurses moved in softer, slower rhythms. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the sand, no longer violent, no longer punishing, but calm and steady, as if the land itself was exhaling. Carl lingered near the cots long after most of the POW volunteers had returned to their barracks. Something inside him refused to leave. Something rooted him here, in this strange sanctuary where the war felt suspended. Others felt it too. Several German wounded slept soundlessly, a few murmured in restless dreams, and one cried quietly into his blanket until a nurse rested a hand on his shoulder to soothe him. American medics whispered to each other as they inventoried supplies. And then Carl noticed someone standing motionless at the far end of the tent. The SS officer. He stood alone beside a cot occupied by a badly injured soldier. The young man's leg was wrapped in thick bandages, suspended at an awkward angle, his face nearly gray with exhaustion. Carl approached slowly, sensing something different in the officer's posture. Not rigid, not cold, not stern. But lost. Is everything all right? Carl asked softly. For a long time the officer didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely louder than the rustle of the tent canvas, he said, "He's from my regiment." Carl's breath caught. He looked more closely at the patient. The sharp jawline, the blonde hair matted with dried sweat, the faint imprint of an SS collar tab on his torn uniform. The officer continued, "He was in my company. I remember him at inspection. He was proud. Too proud. He wanted to impress me." Carl said nothing. The officer's hands, once steady, once symbolic of power, were trembling. "I trained him," the officer whispered. "I told him we were superior. That our cause was righteous. That mercy was weakness." His voice cracked. "And now look at him." Carl felt his chest tighten. The injured man moaned softly, half-conscious. A nurse approached, adjusting the bandage at his temple. The officer stiffened instinctively, old reflexes firing, and then stopped himself. The nurse glanced at him gently. "He'll pull through." The officer swallowed hard, nodding without words. Carl stepped closer. You blame yourself. A long hollow silence. The officer stared at the wounded man, really saw him, for perhaps the first time. Then he whispered, I don't know what to believe anymore. Carl lowered himself so he was eye level with the man. What do you mean? The officer turned toward him, his eyes reflecting something fragile, something he had spent years burying. You and I, we took the same oaths, he murmured. We marched under the same banners. We said the same vows. We shouted the same slogans. Yes, Carl said. We believed the same promises. Carl nodded again. And yet, the officer's voice faltered. Here we are. Being treated by those we were taught to hate. Being healed by those we were told were inhuman. His hands formed fists at his sides. It doesn't make sense, Carl. Carl let out a slow breath. It doesn't have to make sense, he said gently. It just has to be true. The officer shook his head. But if this is true, if they see us as men even now, then everything we were told, everything we were taught to become, his voice broke completely, was a lie. Carl felt the weight of that sentence hit both of them. The Reich had not merely misled them. It had shaped their lives, their morals, their identities. It had dictated who deserved compassion, who deserved life, who deserved death. To let that crumble wasn't simply losing a belief, it was losing a part of yourself. The officer's next words came out in a shuddering exhale. What am I supposed to do with that? Carl looked around the ward. A nurse was carefully wiping a wounded corporal's brow with a damp cloth. An American orderly whispered a joke to a German sergeant, drawing a weak smile. Captain Lewis was writing notes by lantern light, pausing every so often to straighten a blanket or squeeze a shoulder. Carl turned back to the officer. Learn from it, Carl said softly. The officer didn't move. Carl continued, voice steady but gentle. Learn what it means to see people as people. To see worth where you were told there was none. To understand that humanity matters more than ideology. The officer stared at him, eyes glistening. And what then? He whispered. Carl's reply was almost a whisper too. Then you choose who you want to be when the war is over. The officer looked back down at his wounded soldier, the boy he had trained, the boy he had once inspired to believe in cruelty disguised as duty. He lifted the young man's hand and held it gently. As he did, his shoulders sagged, not in defeat but in release. Years of indoctrination, fear, loyalty, and doubt seemed to loosen all at once. I don't know how to start, he said. Carl placed a hand over his. You just did. At that, the officer closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Not to escape. But to accept. The ward was silent, save for the soft breathing of the wounded and the distant sigh of the desert wind. Carl realized something profound in that moment. Healing didn't just happen on cots and bandages. It happened in moments like this, in conversations, in confessions, in the courage to question everything you once believed. For the first time since the war began, a man raised under the shadow of the SS had asked the one question no one in Germany dared ask. And now, finally, he was beginning to answer it. Dawn crept slowly across the Arizona desert, spilling pale gold light through the seams of the hospital tent. The night stillness broke with the soft shuffle of boots, the clink of metal trays, the muted groans of waking wounded. Carl blinked himself awake from a few hours of uneasy rest. He wasn't sure when he'd fallen asleep, only that he'd slumped against the supply cabinet sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But as he stood and stretched the ache from his back, he noticed something unusual. The SS officer was still there, seated, awake, and holding the hand of the young man from his regiment. It wasn't a gesture of power or rank or command. It was a gesture of responsibility. And perhaps, though he would never say it out loud, of remorse. Captain Lewis approached quietly, a clipboard tucked under his arm. Carl straightened instinctively. The officer did too, but he didn't let go of the injured soldier's hand. Lewis glanced at the scene, just briefly, but with a look so subtle Carl almost missed it. A look that said good. He stayed. Lewis cleared his throat. Morning, gentlemen. The officer stiffened. Good morning, Captain. Lewis checked the chart hanging at the foot of the cot. Your man made it through the night. Fever's lower, swelling's down. If the trend continues, he should be stable by evening. The officer exhaled shakily. Thank you. Not rigid. Not forced. But sincere. Lewis nodded once. You're welcome. We take care of everyone here. Carl saw the words land on the officer like a weight and a lifeline at the same time. After Lewis moved on, the officer rubbed his temples. How do they do that? He muttered. Treat us as if we're equal? Carl had no answer. He wasn't sure anyone did. But before he could attempt a response, something caught his eye, a nurse approaching with a small stack of paper envelopes. Mail call for the German ward, she announced gently, placing the bundle on a nearby table. A ripple went through the patients. Mail was rare. Mail from home rarer still. Carl stepped forward to help distribute the letters. Most were addressed in nervous, unfamiliar handwriting, letters from wives, mothers, younger siblings struggling to sound brave. But one envelope was different. It was addressed in careful script. Clean loops. Steady lines. Carl froze when he recognized the name on it. It was addressed to him. As he held it, he suddenly felt as though his hands weren't quite his own. He hadn't received a letter since his capture in Tunisia. Some men hadn't heard from their families in years. His throat tightened. The officer watched him silently. Carl swallowed and opened it slowly, the edges trembling in his fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. His heart pounded as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Anna, his wife. He read, "Carl, we heard nothing for many months and I feared the worst. Then word finally reached us. You were taken prisoner by the Americans. I do not know whether to feel relief or fear, but I pray that you are being treated well." Carl's eyes blurred briefly before he forced himself to continue. "The bombing has grown worse here. Many buildings in Bremen are gone. But we are alive. The children ask about you every night. I tell them that their father is strong and brave and will come home to us." Carl's breath shuddered. He had not cried since he was a boy. But now, he wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve before the tears could fall. The letter ended with, "If the Americans treat you with dignity, then I ask you, Carl, treat them with the same. This war has taken enough from us all." Anna, when he finished, he let the letter fall softly into his lap. He felt hollow and full at the same time, emptied of fear, filled with clarity. "From home?" the officer asked quietly. Carl nodded. "From my wife." The officer hesitated, then spoke, voice low. "What does she say?" Carl handed him the letter. The officer read it slowly. Carl watched his face shift, from curiosity to surprise, to something almost like pain. When he finally handed it back, his voice was barely audible. "She understands more than any of us." Carl folded the letter carefully, reverently. Then the officer asked something Carl had never expected to hear, not from him, not from any SS man. "Would you help me write a reply?" Carl blinked. "You want to write home?" The officer nodded once. And it was not the nod of a soldier obeying duty. It was the nod of a human being trying, desperately, to reconnect with the pieces of himself he feared he had lost forever. Carl sat beside him. "Of course," he said softly. "What do you want to say?" The officer stared at the floor, gathering the words. Then, for the first time, he whispered, "I want to tell the truth." Carl took a blank sheet of paper. "Then let's begin." The tent was awake now, alive with the rustle of linens, the soft clatter of surgical trays, the low hum of morning routines. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, warming the canvas walls with a pale orange glow. Carl sat beside the SS officer at a small wooden table, two chairs pulled close together, a blank sheet of paper between them. The officer's hands hovered above it, unsure, as if touching the page might set off something unstable. Carl dipped a pen into the inkwell and set it down gently. "Start however you like," he said. The officer exhaled, slow and deliberate, as though steadying himself for a confession. "I haven't written home in 6 months, he murmured. "Then start there." The officer nodded, swallowed, and finally lowered the pen to the paper. The nib scratched lightly as he wrote the first words. "My dearest Elise." Carl watched him write, hesitant at first, then more fluidly. Line after line. Sentence after sentence. His brows furrowed, then softened, then tightened again as he confronted memories he had long kept buried under uniform, oath, and ideology. Occasionally his hand trembled. Not from fear, but from honesty. At one point he stopped entirely, staring at the page as though wrestling with something inside himself. Carl leaned forward. "What's wrong?" The officer didn't look up. "I don't know how to say it," he whispered. "Say what?" His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the injured soldier lying a few feet away. Then to the American nurses moving with calm, unhurried purpose. Finally, he said it, "that the enemy has shown me more humanity than I showed my own men." Carl felt the words sink into the air between them, heavy, fragile, true. "Then write that," he said. The officer hesitated. "Elise won't believe it." "That doesn't matter. Write the truth." For the first time since they'd sat down, the officer met Carl's eyes. There was no superiority there. No doctrine. Just a man stripped of armor he never realized he wore. He dipped the pen again and continued. Carl rose quietly, giving him space, and walked toward the cot of the young SS private. The boy was awake now, barely, his pale blue eyes hazy with pain and confusion. Carl knelt beside him. "Good morning," he murmured. The boy blinked. His voice was a dry whisper. "Where am I?" "In an American field hospital," Carl replied. "Arizona." The boy's eyes widened with alarm. "Americans?" His breath quickened. He tried to sit upright but winced, falling back onto the pillow. Carl placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Easy, easy. You're safe." The boy frowned weakly. But they said," he stopped. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They said the Americans would kill them. They said surrender was death. They said mercy did not exist. Carl offered a faint, tired smile. "I know what they said." The boy looked around, at the clean bandages, at the chart above his bed, at the nurse adjusting his splint with gentle fingers. He swallowed hard. "It wasn't true," he whispered. "No," Carl said. "It wasn't." A soft sound drew both their attention. The officer had stopped writing. He sat very still, pen resting loosely in his hand, staring at the nearly full page in front of him. His shoulders rose and fell in steady breaths. Carl approached quietly. "Did you finish?" The officer nodded, slowly, almost disbelievingly, and turned the paper toward Carl. Carl read the final lines. "Tell our son that his father has learned something here, something that no uniform or flag or oath ever taught me. That mercy is not weakness. That dignity is not earned by blood. And that even an enemy can show us what it means to be human." Carl looked up. The officer's face was tight, but no longer hiding. "That's the truth," the officer said quietly. "The truth I never expected to write." Carl folded the letter and slid it into an envelope. "I'll give this to the mail clerk before noon." The officer nodded, the smallest spark of relief in his eyes. But before Carl could step away, the officer added, "Carl, when this war ends," he said softly, "I hope we remember this place. This moment. All of us." Carl nodded. He hoped so too. But war had a way of burying moments like this beneath rubble and history. Then something unexpected happened. The young SS private whispered, "Herr Obersturmführer?" The officer turned quickly. "I'm here." The boy's eyes fought to stay open. "You came back for me?" The officer moved to his side, gripping his hand with unusual tenderness. "Yes," he replied. "I came back." The boy managed a weak smile. And then, for the first time Carl had ever seen, the officer brushed a hand over the boy's hair, not as a commander but as a guardian. Carl watched the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and clarity. Men who had been shaped to dehumanize others were slowly rediscovering their own humanity. And it was happening here, in the quiet of a desert hospital, far from Berlin, far from propaganda, far from the endless noise of war. Just men. Just truth. Just a moment that would outlast the conflict raging an ocean away. The desert morning sharpened into full daylight, warm and unblinking. Heat shimmered just outside the hospital tent, but inside the air held steady, a mixture of antiseptic, canvas, and the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting from the nearby mess. Carl was helping an orderly restack crates of bandages when a distant rumble carried across the compound. Engines. Heavy ones. The kind that announced someone important. The kind that made every POW glance toward the doors, instinctively straightening their posture. Moments later, a shout echoed, "Attention! Medical inspection incoming." Carl exchanged a look with the SS officer, a silent question, a silent warning, before the tent flap opened and 3 American officers strode inside. At the center was a stocky man with silver hair and a crisp uniform, Colonel Theodore Markham, Chief Medical Officer of the Western POW District. He carried presence like a weight but not a threatening one. More like a man who expected standards and accepted no excuses. Behind him walked Captain Lewis, stiff as a board, clearly hoping everything was in perfect order. "Colonel on deck," a medic whispered. Carl and the other POWs instinctively stepped back against the walls. The SS officer stiffened, jaw tightening, but he remained at the private's bedside. Markham began the inspection immediately, moving cot to cot, asking pointed questions, examining charts with sharp, clinical eyes. "How many Germans in orthopedic recovery? Any cases of infection post-surgery? Has hydration protocol been followed since the heat spike yesterday?" Each question fired off like a command. Lewis answered with steady confidence. the nurses with calm precision, the medics with practiced discipline. Not once did the colonel raise his voice. Not once did he address the POWs as anything less than patients. Finally, Markham stopped at the cot of the young SS private. The boy tensed, attempting to shift into a more formal posture despite the pain. "Lie still, soldier," Markham said, voice firm but not unkind. "Let's take a look." He examined the bandages, gently pressed around the wound, checked the pulse, then exhaled softly. "You'll live," he said. "Make sure he gets extra fluids today," he added to a nurse. Then he turned, and his eyes landed on the SS officer. There was no fear in the officer's face. No challenge. Just wary respect. Markham studied him a moment, then asked, "You his commanding officer?" The SS man nodded. "Yes, Colonel." Markham extended a hand, not to shake, but in a gesture that meant move aside. "Let me see him fully." The officer obeyed instantly. Markham looked over the soldier again, then said something that stunned both the officer and Carl. "You stayed with him all night." It wasn't a question. The officer's throat bobbed. "Yes." Markham's gaze softened, barely but unmistakably. "That's good," he said. "Your presence helped him make it through the fever spike." The SS officer blinked, as if unsure how to process acknowledgement from an American officer. Markham continued around the cot, checking a few more notes. Then the moment came. The one that would burn itself into the memories of every man in that tent. The colonel finished his examination, straightened, and said, "Captain Lewis, ensure both these men," he gestured to the private and then, to Carl's astonishment, to the SS officer, "receive full access to the Red Cross parcels arriving this afternoon." The SS officer froze. "That includes me?" he asked quietly. Markham stared at him with a gaze carved from granite and conviction. "Son," he said, "a wounded man in my hospital is a patient. Not a prisoner. Not a rank. Not a uniform." He paused. "And a patient receives every courtesy we can provide." The words fell over the tent like a hush, like a verdict, like a revelation. Even the Americans in the room seemed to stand a little straighter. The SS officer swallowed hard, his composure fracturing for just a split second. Then unexpectedly he said, "Sir, why?" Markham seemed almost surprised by the question. "Because that's how we fight," he answered simply. "And that's how we win." He turned and continued the inspection, his boots clicking against the wooden flooring panels as he moved on. The tent remained silent for several long seconds. When the colonel had stepped outside, the officers following him, the world slowly resumed. But not as it had before. The SS officer lowered himself into the chair beside the private's cot, staring at nothing, at everything, at the ground that had just shifted beneath his feet. Carl approached quietly. "That was unexpected," he murmured. The officer didn't look up. But his voice, when it came, was thin and unsteady. "Carl, I don't understand them." Carl sat beside him. "Neither did I. Not at first." The officer ran a hand through his hair, fingers trembling slightly. "If this is how they treat enemies, what does that say about us?" he whispered. Carl didn't answer. Because the SS officer already knew. All around them, the tent seemed to breathe, a quiet chorus of wounded men resting, healing, surviving. And somewhere beyond the canvas walls, a war still raged. But inside this tent, for this moment, a different battle was being fought. A battle inside the hearts of men who had been told all their lives what to believe, only to discover in the most unlikely place what was true. Afternoon settled over Camp Florence with a soft, shimmering heat. The kind of heat that blurred distant fences into wavering silver lines and made every footstep feel heavier than the last. Inside the hospital tent, though, the world felt oddly cool, quiet, calm, almost insulated from the desert beyond. The wounded slept. Nurses moved in hushed rhythms. A medic hummed under his breath while organizing supplies. Carl was rinsing a metal basin when a familiar voice stirred behind him. "You seem calmer than yesterday." It was Captain Lewis. Carl turned. "A lot has changed since yesterday, sir." Lewis gave a small, knowing nod. His eyes flicked toward the SS officer, who was sitting beside the young private's cot, reading the letter he had written over and over again, as if trying to memorize every word. "You handled him well," Lewis said quietly. Carl blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "Most captured SS officers don't respond to kindness. You found the right approach." Carl shook his head. "I didn't do anything special." Lewis looked at him with narrowed, thoughtful eyes. "You listened," he said. "That's more than most men ever manage in war." The words settled over Carl with unexpected weight. Before he could respond, a nurse entered carrying a small wooden crate. Red Cross parcels just arrived, she announced. Instantly the room shifted. Men who could barely sit up tried to. Those awake turned with sudden alertness. Even the lethargic stirred at the sound of those 3 words. Carl helped distribute the parcels. Small cardboard boxes stamped with the unmistakable red emblem. Inside were things that felt like treasures. Chocolate, cigarettes, canned beef, soap, postcards. The young SS private clutched his box as though it were a lifeline. But when Carl handed one to the officer, the man froze. As ordered, Carl said gently. The officer took the parcel with both hands, but he didn't open it. He just stared at it. I don't deserve this, he murmured. Carl felt the truth of those words, not in judgment but in recognition. He remembered feeling the same weeks after his capture. He placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. No one deserves anything in war, he said softly. But we accept what mercy gives. The officer looked at him, conflicted, humbled, shaken. I don't know how to be this person, he confessed. I was never taught. Carl met his gaze steadily. Then learn. The officer lowered his head in something like gratitude, something like surrender. But before either man could speak again, someone at the far end of the tent began to sing. At first it was faint, barely a murmur carried on breath weakened by pain. A single voice. Thin, rough, tentative. But the melody was unmistakable. Still nacked, silent night. Carl turned sharply. The singer was an older sergeant with bandaged ribs, eyes closed, voice trembling. A few cots away another voice joined him, soft but steady. Then another. Then 2 more. Soon the tent was filled with the echo of a hymn every German soldier knew by heart. A song older than their uniforms, older than the propaganda, older than the war that had swallowed their lives. Alles schlaft, einsam wacht, all is calm, all is bright. The private's eyes glistened. He tried to sing but his throat tightened with emotion. Carl felt the music wash over him like something warm and painful all at once. Memories of home. January 10, 1945. Edwards wrote about the hospital, about recovering slower than he wanted, about doctors who insisted he rest despite his repeated claims that he was perfectly operational. He mentioned headaches but dismissed them as nothing. He thanked Carl for the detailed reply, saying he had read it 3 times. He ended with, I'm glad you wrote so openly. You make these long days feel shorter. Carl pressed the paper to his chest for a moment before reaching for the second. January 27, 1945. Edwards wrote from a different location, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. He described the glare of the sun, the heat, the frustration of being reassigned to a stateside training position while he recovered. He spoke of wanting to return to the front, though he admitted it with less enthusiasm than conviction. But maybe, he wrote, maybe being alive is reason enough to stay put for now. Carl smiled faintly. He opened the third. February 5, 1945. The tone shifted. Edwards mentioned dizzy spells. A doctor recommending long-term rest. Paperwork delaying his return to duty. Restlessness. Boredom. And then, I'm starting to think too much. About things I never thought about before. About you. About the words you wrote. About the fact that someone out there, even behind wire, understands me more than people right in front of me. Carl felt warmth spread through his chest, slow and deep. Then he picked up the 4th letter. It was dated February 22, 1945. He unfolded it carefully. This one had been hit hardest by the rain, smudging the ink around the edges. Edward's handwriting was shakier. Carl, they're sending me for tests. Something with the headaches. I'm not worried. But if my letters slow down, I don't want you to think I forgot you. I won't. You're one of the few things that feel clear these days. I'll write as soon as I know more. Frank. Carl's eyes stung. He read the letter twice. 3 times. Then he placed all 4 envelopes side by side and lowered his forehead onto his folded arms. Relief hit him first, blinding, overwhelming relief. Then fear seeped in around the edges. Headaches. Tests. Shaky handwriting. Something was wrong. He sensed it in the space between the words. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the roof with steady, relentless force. Carl reached for a blank sheet of stationery. He dipped the pen. And he wrote. He wrote fast, his hand barely keeping pace with his thoughts. He told Edwards he was thinking of him constantly, that he hoped the tests were nothing serious, that the library was lonely without his letters, that, though he didn't quite write the word, he missed him. As he sealed the envelope, the storm outside cracked with thunder. Carl whispered, "Please be all right." Because he suddenly understood. These letters were no longer a distraction. No longer a curiosity. No longer simply kindness. They were the most important thing in his world. March melted into April with a sluggishness that made every day feel the same. Gray mornings. Muddy paths. The clatter of tin cups at breakfast. And Carl, always Carl, checking the mail line with a quiet desperation he tried and failed to hide. He wrote every week. Sometimes twice a week. Short letters, long letters, letters where he tried to keep things light, others where he allowed himself to write plainly, honestly. He described the small things, how the library smelled when the sun finally warmed the wood, how the camp dog liked to sleep under the porch steps, how the men argued about books they pretended not to care about. He never wrote the one thing at the center of his thoughts: don't disappear. April 3rd passed. Then April 7th. Then April 10th, the 1-year mark since he had first met Edwards in that field hospital. Still nothing. By mid-April, even the guards noticed his tension. One of them, a young corporal who occasionally borrowed newspapers from the library, stopped Carl as he shelved books. "You're waiting for word," he said not unkindly. Carl nodded. The guard hesitated. Fronts collapsing. Germans retreating everywhere. Communications are a mess, for both sides. Wouldn't assume the worst. Carl appreciated the attempt. But it didn't soothe the ache tightening in his chest. By April 17th, the waiting became a physical weight. His appetite vanished. His sleep fractured. He worked longer hours to stay busy, but the quiet of the library only amplified his thoughts. One afternoon, rain tapped lazily against the windows as Carl sorted a new batch of donated English novels, mostly romances and adventure stories. His hands moved automatically, but his eyes drifted again and again to the door. Then, faintly, a whistle blew from across the yard. Mail call. His pulse jumped. He wiped his hands on his trousers and forced himself not to sprint. Outside, prisoners formed a loose line near the usual post table. Carl joined them, heart pounding. The cold wind stung his face, but he barely felt it. The mail runner called out names. A letter to Weber. Another to Hauser. 2 for Muller. 1 parcel for Lieutenant Braun. Nothing for Becker. The knot inside tightened. The mail runner folded his list. That's it. Carl swallowed, nodded, and stepped aside. He didn't trust himself to speak. The prisoners dispersed, some cheerful, some disappointed. Carl walked slowly back toward the library, his boots squelching in the wet soil. Inside, he sat at his desk and lowered his head into his hands. Maybe the tests had found something serious. Maybe he was too ill to write. Maybe, he cut off the thought, refusing to let it form. The door creaked open. Carl looked up sharply. It was not the mail runner. It was the camp commander. The older man stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his coat, cap tucked under one arm. His face was unreadable. "For you, Becker," the commander said quietly. He held out a single envelope. Carl froze. His name was written on it. But the handwriting, it wasn't Edwards. It was neater. More formal. Written with deliberate care. Carl's stomach dropped. His fingers trembled as he took it. The commander gave him a long, steady look. "Take your time." Then he stepped out, closing the door behind him. The library felt suddenly too small, too still. Carl sat down slowly, the envelope clutched in both hands. He turned it over. The return address was military typed. Not handwritten. His breath shuddered. He slid a finger beneath the flap. Ripped it open. Inside was one sheet of paper. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the first line, and everything inside him went cold. "This letter concerns Captain Frank W. Edwards." The rest blurred. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. His hands clenched the paper so tightly it crinkled. He forced himself to read. Every word. Slowly. Deliberately. Until the final sentence drove itself into him like a blade. Carl did not move. Did not speak. Did not breathe for several long moments. Then, with a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob, he pressed the letter to his forehead and whispered, "Frank, no." Outside, the rain kept falling, steady, indifferent, endless. The words blurred again as Carl read them a second time, slow, mechanical, as if his brain refused to accept their meaning. Captain Frank W. Edwards has been admitted to Brooke Army Medical Center following complications related to a cranial injury sustained during active service. Carl squeezed his eyes shut. Complications. A clinical word. Cold. Detached. It told him everything and nothing. He forced himself to keep reading. At present, Captain Edwards is under evaluation for neurological trauma. His condition is considered serious but not imminently life-threatening. Further communication will be provided when possible. Please be advised that he is currently unable to send or receive mail directly. Unable. The word hit harder than any blow. Carl lowered the paper, staring at it as though the ink might rearrange itself into something less devastating. His heartbeat felt uneven, pulsing like it was trying to keep pace with something collapsing inside him. Frank wasn't gone. He wasn't dead. But he was unreachable. Serious. Neurological. Unable. These were words that lived on the edge of disaster. He set the letter down carefully on the table, palms pressed flat as if anchoring himself to the room. The library was silent. Too silent. Carl's breath came in slow, shaky pulls. His pulse throbbed behind his eyes. He leaned back in the chair and stared up at the ceiling, letting his vision blur as the truth settled into every corner of his mind. Frank had been writing through pain, through dizziness, through fear, and still he'd written. Carl pressed both hands to his face. He remembered Edward's last shaky lines, "I won't forget you." He hadn't forgotten. He had written until he physically couldn't. The room swayed. Carl stood abruptly, fists clenched as if motion might keep the grief from crushing him. He took a step toward the shelves, then another, pacing between rows of books he'd organized 100 times. His boots scuffed the floor in a rapid, uneven rhythm. He wanted to write back. Immediately. Desperately. But to whom? The return address was a department office, not Frank himself. A place where his letter would be opened by someone in uniform who would read it, evaluate it, and decide whether it could be delivered, or whether it would vanish into a bureaucratic void. Still, he needed to write. He needed words on paper even if no one ever saw them. Carl grabbed a sheet of stationery and sat again, the chair legs scraping loudly across the floorboards. He held the pen tightly enough to make his knuckles ache. The first sentence came out halting, uneven, to the attending physician or officer in charge of Captain Frank W. Edwards. He paused. It was too formal. Too stiff. Too far from what he felt. He tried again. Please tell Captain Edwards that I received word of his condition. I'm hoping every day that he recovers. He is important to me. More than I can say in one letter. He stopped, stared at the last line and exhaled shakily. Should he rewrite it? Soften it? Hide it? No. No more hiding. He kept writing. If he is able to hear messages or if anything can be read to him, please tell him that I am grateful for every letter he sent. Tell him I haven't forgotten any of them. Tell him that the world feels larger because he exists in it. Even now. His hand trembled. Ink trembled with it. Finally he signed, Carl Becker, POW number 21846. He folded the letter. Sealed it. Stared at the envelope as if it were a lifeline woven from nothing more than hope and thin paper. Outside, the rain slowed to a soft patter. The sky had dimmed to an overcast blue, a color that felt like holding one's breath. Carl stood, gripping the envelope. He walked out of the library and crossed the yard, ignoring the puddles soaking his boots. At the camp office, he handed the letter to the guard on duty. For mailing, he said, and his voice nearly broke on the last word. The guard took it without question. Carl watched the envelope disappear into the outgoing bin. A single piece of his heart sealed inside. He stood there for a long moment, still, silent, before finally stepping back into the gray daylight. He didn't know if the letter would reach Frank. He didn't know if Frank would ever read it. He didn't know if Frank would recover. But he had sent it. And that was something stronger than despair. Something like defiance. Something like faith. As he walked back toward the library, the first thin beam of sunlight broke through the clouds. It fell across the muddy yard, across the wire fence, across the rows of weathered barracks, and then across his face. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. And breathed. The sun didn't last. By evening, clouds had gathered again, heavy and swollen over the camp, pressing a kind of weight onto everyone's shoulders. But Carl didn't feel it. Not tonight. For the first time in weeks, he slept without tossing, exhaustion overtaking him the moment he lay down. He dreamed of nothing. No letters. No hospital rooms. No rain-soaked envelopes. Only a deep, empty dark that felt almost like rest. He woke before dawn to the sound of distant engines, multiple, deep-throated, rolling across the horizon. The barracks stirred. Men muttered. Someone cursed softly. Tanks? One whispered. No, another said. Trucks. Big ones. Carl sat up. His heart was already beating faster. He dressed quickly and stepped outside into a chill that smelled of wet earth. A low mist wrapped the camp. Through it, he saw headlights flashing beyond the perimeter road, convoys moving steadily toward the main gate. He wasn't the only one watching. Guards stood stiff, alert. Prisoners clustered in small, tense groups. Something was happening. The commotion built as the sun slogged above the horizon. By breakfast, rumors were spreading like wildfire. The war is collapsing. The Western Front is gone. The Americans are pushing into Germany itself. Commanders are meeting with the camp officers right now. Carl barely touched his food. Around noon, a whistle shrilled from the central yard. All prisoners assemble. The tone was different today, sharper, almost urgent. Men filed out, gathering in uneven rows, murmuring under their breath. Carl took his place among them, hands clasped behind his back to keep them steady. The camp commander stepped onto a wooden platform, flanked by 2 American officers Carl had never seen before. The commander held a sheet of paper. He looked older than he had yesterday. When he spoke, his voice carried but lacked its usual firmness. Prisoners will stand at attention. A hush swept the yard. The commander cleared his throat. Earlier this morning we received official notification from Allied High Command. He paused, jaw tightening. The Western Allied forces have crossed the Rhine on multiple fronts. German defensive lines have collapsed. Shock rippled through the prisoners. Some gasped, others stiffened, others bowed their heads. But the commander wasn't finished. As of this hour, he continued, the nearest German command authority in this sector has been overrun. Communications are severed. Command has determined that this camp will transition into full Allied custody. The word struck like a blow. Full Allied custody. Carl's heartbeat thudded in his ears. The American Army, the commander said, gesturing to the officers beside him, is now responsible for your protection, care, and eventual processing. Men murmured louder now, some in disbelief, others in visible relief. Then the American officer stepped forward, boots thudding on the platform. He unfolded a document. I am Colonel James Ellison of the U.S. Third Army, he announced. By order of General Patton, all German POWs in this region are to remain in place under American jurisdiction. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Medical evaluations will be conducted within the next 48 hours. Someone near Carl exhaled shakily. Patton. Got him Himmel? Ellison continued, voice steady, practiced. Additionally, due to transportation constraints and ongoing combat operations, mail services will be suspended temporarily while routes are re-established. The word stabbed through Carl like ice. Mail suspended. No letters in. No letters out. A lump formed in his throat. Ellison scanned the crowd. We understand many of you have family concerns, he added. We will restore communication channels as soon as operationally possible. Carl barely heard the rest. His mind was spinning. Suspended. How long? Days. Weeks. Months? What if another update about Frank came? What if Frank woke up? What if Frank worsened? What if? The assembly dispersed slowly. Guards guided men back toward the yard's periphery while American personnel began pacing the fence line, inspecting structures and checkpoints. Carl drifted away from the crowd, moving toward the library without thinking. Inside, he shut the door and pressed his back against it. His breath shook. His hands trembled. Every instinct screamed to write something, anything, in case the mail reopened. But even that small hope felt paper-thin. He walked to the table where Frank's 4 letters lay. He touched each envelope gently. I'm still here, he whispered. Then suddenly voices rose outside, urgent, overlapping, calling across the yard. Boots pounded. An engine growled closer. A truck door slammed. Carl stepped to the window. 2 American medics were unloading something from the back of a transport truck. A stretcher. A figure lay strapped to it. Carl froze, breath caught halfway in his lungs. The medics lifted the stretcher carefully. One of them shouted to the camp commander. Another waved for assistance. The patient was bundled in blankets. An 4-bag hung from a metal stand. A bandage wrapped around the head. For one impossible, electrifying second, Carl thought, it can't be. His hands pressed against the glass. The medics moved too fast for him to see clearly. Then the stretcher disappeared through the infirmary doors. Carl staggered back from the window, pulse racing so fiercely he felt dizzy. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. But still, his heart thundered with a single wild thought. What if Frank is here? For several long minutes Carl stood motionless in the center of the library, breath shallow, pulse hammering. Reason told him the thought was absurd. There was no way, no possible way, that Frank Edwards would be brought to this camp, this remote corner of the Midwest, this out-of-the-way POW facility. And yet, the image wouldn't leave his mind, the bandaged head, the 4-line, the urgency in the medic's movements. His hands shook uncontrollably. After what felt like an eternity, he forced himself toward the door. The moment he stepped outside, cold air slapped him across the face. Men hurried around the yard, guards shifting posts, American officers directing movement, prisoners whispering anxiously. But Carl barely registered any of it. His eyes locked on the infirmary building. He walked toward it on unsteady legs. 2 American medics stood outside the door, speaking in low, rapid English. One held a clipboard. The other scrubbed his hands with alcohol from a small tin. Carl approached slowly, unsure if they'd stop him. One noticed him first. "Hey, POW. You can't be near this entrance." Carl froze, hands raised slightly. Bit Narine Frage, I just want to ask." The medic frowned. "English." Carl swallowed. "Please, the man you brought. Is..." His throat tightened painfully. "Is there a name? A name you can tell me?" The medic with the clipboard exchanged a glance with the other. "We don't release patient identity to prisoners," he said bluntly. Of course they wouldn't." Carl's hope flickered. He stepped back, chest hollowing. But then the second medic, still drying his hands, spoke more softly. "He's American Army. Captain. Head trauma. That's all I can tell you. Captain." The word hit like lightning. Carl's mouth went dry. "Captain Edwards?" The medic blinked, surprised. "Can't confirm that." Which was not a no. Not a denial. And it was more than enough to ignite the hope roaring through Carl's chest. He stepped forward again despite himself. "Please, I know him. I wrote to him." He stopped, unable to reveal more without risking disaster. The medic watched him closely. Something in Carl's face must have reached him, because the man's expression softened just a fraction. "I'll say this much," he murmured. "The patient we brought in, he had letters in his personal effects." Carl's heart lurched. He was clutching one when they moved him from the ambulance. Carl couldn't breathe. Could you see the name?" he whispered. The medic exhaled. "Couldn't read it. Ink was smeared, rain-soaked. But he held on so tight we had to pry it from his hand." Carl closed his eyes. His hands trembled violently at his sides. The medic lowered his voice. "Whoever he is, he's fighting hard." Carl opened his eyes. They burned with a desperate mix of hope, fear, disbelief, longing. "I need to see him," he said, barely more than a breath. The medic shook his head. "Not possible. He's unconscious. Doctors are working on him now." "But, no visitors," the man repeated firmly. "Not even other soldiers. You'd be turned away before you got near the door." Carl sagged. The wind rustled his jacket. Mud sucked at his boots. He felt suddenly small, powerless, trapped once more behind invisible walls that had nothing to do with the barbed wire around him. But he couldn't just walk away. The medic noticed the devastation on Carl's face, and something shifted in his expression. After a moment, he spoke quietly without looking directly at him. "There's a supply window on the east side of the infirmary," he said. "Sometimes it stays open for ventilation. If a patient is near that wall," he gave the tiniest shrug, "you might hear something." Carl stared at him, breath caught. The medic stepped back. "I didn't tell you that," he muttered. Then he turned toward the door and disappeared inside. Carl stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding wildly in his chest. Then he turned slowly, deliberately, toward the east side of the building. Each step felt unreal. Each heartbeat louder than the last. If Frank was here. If he was alive. If he was fighting, Carl had to be close. Even if only to listen. Even if only to whisper a few words into the air between them. He reached the east wall. The small ventilation window sat just a few feet above eye level, propped open by a rusted hinge, letting out the faintest draft of antiseptic and warm air. Carl stepped closer. Closer. He held his breath. From inside came muffled voices, doctors speaking, boots scuffing, equipment clinking. A faint sound. A strained, broken exhale. Not a word. Not strong. Barely more than breath. But human. Alive. Carl pressed his palm to the brick wall, eyes burning. And whispered, trembling, "Frank, if you can hear me, I'm here." The wind shifted. Somewhere inside, a monitor beeped softly. Carl leaned his forehead against the wall. He didn't know if Frank could hear him. But somehow, impossibly, he felt closer to him than he had in months. Carl stayed at the wall until the cold seeped through his jacket and numbed his hands, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. Every small sound from inside, the scrape of metal, a muttered instruction, a soft groan, sent a jolt of electricity through him. He strained to separate them, to isolate the one voice he longed for, but everything blended into a haze of noise and hope. Then for a moment the inside room fell quiet. Carl leaned closer. A soft shuffle. A rustle of fabric. A breath, shallow, uneven. Then a voice. Rough. Weak. Barely audible through the window. Wah. Tuh. Carl's knees nearly buckled. It was him. It was him. It didn't matter that the voice was shattered into fragments. It didn't matter that the word barely formed. He knew that sound. He had memorized every cadence, every low laugh, every gentle murmur Frank had ever spoken to him. Across the field, across the wire, across their letters. Carl pressed closer to the bricks, eyes stinging. Frank, he whispered. Frank bit, hold on. Inside, a different voice responded, an American doctor, brisk but steady. Easy, Captain. You're safe. Water's coming. Captain. It hit Carl with a force nearly physical. Frank Edwards. Alive. Here. Carl felt something inside him break loose. A sob he swallowed back, shoulders trembling silently as he braced himself against the wall. He didn't dare speak louder. Didn't dare let the staff hear him. But he whispered, voice trembling, "You're not alone. I'm here. I'm right here." For a few heartbeats, the room inside quieted again. Then, faint as a breath through leaves, came another fractured syllable. Ka. Carl froze. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of sound. Ka, Arl. A choking sound escaped him, half sob, half disbelief. His hand flew to his mouth to keep quiet, tears spilling unchecked. Frank had said his name. Unconscious, injured, barely clinging to awareness, he had said his name. Carl leaned his forehead against the cold brick, crying silently, fiercely. Inside, the doctor spoke again, oblivious. Vitals rising. Good. He's responding. Carl closed his eyes. Frank, he whispered through tears, I'm here. I'm here. The wind carried away his words, but it didn't matter. Frank had heard him. Even at the edge of consciousness, even through pain and confusion, even in a place he should never have been, he had reached for Carl. And Carl would not leave him. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until he knew Frank was safe. He straightened slowly, wiping his face with trembling fingers. He took one last steadying breath and looked up at the small ventilation window, at the faint glow from inside, at the fragile thread connecting them through brick and air and hope. Then he whispered, soft but certain, "This isn't the end," and turned back toward the yard, toward a future he no longer feared. Because Frank was alive. And that was enough.